This story begins in an elite private school called Yggdrasil, which is located on a vast territory and has several buildings. A young man in a student uniform called out to a girl named Ellie and touched her shoulder to get her attention. The high school student turned around and asked in surprise what could be so important that she was so abruptly distracted. But when Ellie saw the object of her attention in front of her, her face immediately flushed with embarrassment. She was a famous person, an extremely attractive and refined personality, and those around her caught her gestures and movements with delight and awe. And the dazzling beauty of her attire stood out even against the backdrop of the descendants of noble families. The beauty's name was Aslania Livenshirt, and word of this lady spread far ahead, generating admiration in some and envy in others. Besides her striking appearance, the girl was also known for being a member of a special student organization called Sky. The boys gathered in the schoolyard animatedly discussed not only her beauty and status, but also recalled her noble blood, since Aslania belonged to the family of the Duke of Livenshirt himself. One of the students, upon seeing the aristocrat, folded her hands in prayer and began to extol her virtues, insisting that the lady was simply an idol to be worshipped. Suddenly, one of the guys expressed doubt that the described virtues really belonged to this girl, and those around him looked at him in surprise. Meanwhile, the high school student continued. He said that he had completely different information, that the real Lady Livenshirt had an extremely bad character. The brave man did not stop, even when the brilliant beauty approached the crowd of students, and added that she was under the power of pride as well as greed. The furious girl also heard several nasty comments about her figure. Her face turned red with anger, and her rage was ready to burst out. Finally, Aslania screamed that this was a blatant lie, but suddenly realized that everything up to this moment had been just a dream. The lady sat up in bed and took a deep breath, feeling relieved that it had been just a nightmare. However, there were very serious reasons for such dreams. This was clear even from the girl's hands. The face and figure of the night beauty also spoke for themselves. So it is not surprising that Aslania's subconscious presented her with unpleasant situations during her nightly immersions in the world of dreams. Indeed, the Duke of Levenshirt's eldest daughter had noticeable problems with excess weight, and the people around her considered the girl an unsociable teenager. To top it all off, the heiress of the family played the role of a negative character in the game Fantastic Attraction. And looking at the wall of her room, Aslania recalled episodes from this toy, because only there did she have at least some control and moral support for her psyche. The point of the game was to develop the hero and improve his skills to achieve specific goals. The girl, while in the ward, was only interested in this. In this universe, which became a new real life for the patient, accessible from any electronic device, it was possible to do more than just communicate with friends. Here it was possible to create your own buildings in particular castles and modernize them. And at the very end, the player could see one of the endings to which his actions led. Aslania spent so much time in this virtual world that she had already managed to watch all the possible screensavers offered by the developers. Although this was incredibly difficult, it was an extremely difficult game in general, where one careless decision could lead to total defeat, so not all players successfully reached the positive final ending. The main game location was Yggdrasil, a closed school for child prodigies where exams were held every semester, and failure meant the need to retake them. If the additional check also failed, the student, that is the player, was immediately expelled from the establishment, and the game ended for him. The difficulty was that the character was required to maintain a sympathy level, which meant there was a need to flirt with others, but flirting lowered the intelligence needed for studying. But if you concentrate on learning, then sympathy decreases, and the player quickly gets negative ending number 10. It was difficult to balance, as the user could very rarely find a happy medium, developing everything in parallel, and often received one of the alternate endings, for example, 23, informing that the heroine became a servant. There were other negative endings, like this one number 63, where the player was told outright that he had missed all his chances and was left all alone. All these difficulties weeded out a huge number of interested players and prevented them from even getting close to the main part of the game, but Aslania managed to find a way to maintain a delicate balance. Further, Livenshirt realized that the actions in the game were reflected in the real world, and the coincidences were complete, right down to the names of the main characters, princes and kings. For some unknown reason, the girl's consciousness entered into one of the bosses, who was considered a villain in the game, world reflected in reality. The game's bad guys were skilled in magic and posed a great danger to those around them. With the help of terrible spells, sorcerers and witches could bring down incredible suffering on the heads of innocent people. There have been cases where unfortunate people were placed in an airless bubble while sleeping and literally suffocated without regaining consciousness. The villains also kidnapped their victims, tied them tightly, and burned them alive. Aslanaya recalled that there were other negative endings in this game that she didn't even want to think about. Yes, there were some very tough and bloodthirsty game mechanics here, so character development had to be done carefully and thoughtfully to avoid returning to the beginning at the most unexpected moment. Negative characters possessed great strength and power, and therefore had to be feared, and conflict situations had to be avoided at all costs in order to survive at least until the end of the next plot stage. There were plenty of villains, but not all of them were strong and powerful. Some died by the middle of the gameplay, and closer to the end, bosses appeared. Deadly guys. For example, a tall blonde man with an arrogant smile named Rudin, better known as the Prince of Light, is a powerful opponent. Or Yuven, called the Messenger of the Dark Forces, always calm, cold-blooded, and a powerful enemy. And rounding out the trio of powerful bosses is the already familiar to us, Aslania, nicknamed the Steel Empress, a truly dangerous and bloodthirsty enemy. It was into this that our main character moved, and it is noteworthy that her height and weight by the end of the game were equal to each other and stopped at the mark of 170 cm, or kilograms. Due to such proportions, Lady Levenshurt had an impressive list of illnesses, from diabetes to spinal problems, in total almost 20 different ailments. This means that the number of possible endings to her story was predetermined. For example, it could have been suffocation during a night's sleep, or cardiac arrest due to its unstable functioning periodic rhythm disturbances and disruption of the entire cardiovascular system. Other illnesses also gradually killed the girl, becoming a source of endless pain and incredible suffering. In fact, the patient spent her entire life in a medical facility, since only there could she be guaranteed the frequent emergency care she desperately needed. And one day, the body finally couldn't handle the strain and was powerless against the piled-up burden of problems, and even medicine couldn't change anything. The patient died, but after death, her consciousness moved into the form of a game boss, so in a way, life gave this unfortunate creature or immortal soul another chance. Standing in front of the mirror, a renewed Levenshurt promised herself that this time she would do everything right. Change and first and foremost, take care of her own health. Fantastic Attraction was originally conceived as a dating simulator where a character could be developed in various directions, although only one person ever saw all the endings. Looking at the multi-tiered tray filled with all sorts of sweet and delicious dishes, the girl categorically declared that she refused to eat it. The maid was very surprised and asked if all these cakes and muffins were not enough for her, and if the lady wanted even more different desserts. To which Aslania replied that from that day on, she no longer wants to have sweet snacks in the mornings, but plans to change her diet and is starting a diet right now. The maid was shocked to the depths of her soul. She could expect any whims and childishness from her mistress, but this went beyond the bounds of her behavior. Frantically looking at the ceiling, the girl tried to find the words and began to go through possible versions of what had happened. Finally, she settled on the fact that they wanted to fire them all. She shared her thoughts with another maid who agreed and suggested that the mistress would pretend to be on a hunger strike for a few days, and then seeing no results, would blame the servants for it. The whole house watched in amazement as the little girl began running in the mornings in the courtyard of her luxurious mansion between the neatly trimmed green bushes. Despite the sidelong glances of those around her, Aslanaya continued training in the fresh air, motivated by one simple circumstance that hung over her every minute: a painful death. Through pain, tears, and sweat, Lady Levenshurt continued her persistent torture of her own small, plump body, while she thought about how to speed up the restoration of health. Having completely lost her strength, the girl stopped to catch her breath and then began to think about whether she should perhaps add other exercises or hire a trainer. Suddenly, someone called out to her, and turning around, Aslania saw her parents, who were watching her training with the same surprise and apprehension as all the servants. Young, beautiful, and healthy parents almost cried as they watched their plump daughter struggle to find a proper figure and wondered where such changes came from. The father and mother rushed to their daughter, began to hug her, and tell her that she was not fat at all, but had the most ideal figure, and that she should not lose weight but gain it. The parents' words painted a terrifying picture of their heiress exhausting herself with hunger strikes and about to collapse from extreme exhaustion and weight loss. And even when the child showed folds of hanging fat on his body, the adults only closed their eyes and continued to cry bitterly and lament the grief that had befallen their family. Aslaniya persistently tried to prove to her parents that they were wrong, that she needed to take a closer look at herself and reduce her figure to an acceptable size. Trying to get through to her parents, the girl insisted that she really needed to lose weight, and if they continued to pressure her, she would stop eating at the same table with them. The father and mother were shocked by their daughter's behavior and her attempt to blackmail them in such an unusual way. Then their confusion turned to anger and irritation. Duke Livinsert frowned and said that she should not talk like that, and she should change her attitude towards this matter. A cold light flashed in his eyes, indicating that the man was extremely dissatisfied with the events that were taking place. Then the father quickly pulled a pitiful mask over his face and said that he shouldn't torture himself in vain because it could be dangerous to his health. During the next meal, when the girl was trying to eat only low-calorie foods, the issue of Aslaniya's interactions with children her age was raised at the table. And while the mother watched in awe as her daughter devoured only lettuce leaves, the father continued that his friend, the Marquis of Appleton, had a son of about the same age. Watching the rebel girl consume the grass, Levinshurt added that the boy had few acquaintances, and they could find a common language, and ideally, even become friends. The restless soul thought that in her past life, she had no friends at all, because it is hard to make friends when you are in a hospital ward all day long and feel unwell. Many times as a sick child confined to a medical institution, she thought about how wonderful it would be to have a real friend. The teenager's envy knew no bounds because she also wanted to laugh and joke with her peers, play games, have fun, or just spend time doing whatever it was. Putting down her fork, Aslaniya thought that making a real friend was a great idea as he could help her and support her on her path to health recovery. The girl had already created a beautiful picture in her head and was now ready to transfer it into reality, and therefore happily agreed to her parents' proposal. Then the heiress joyfully asked when she would be able to meet her first friend. In fact, the father wanted to use his own daughter to get into the Marquise's dinner party. This was his main purpose in proposing friendship with the boy. Moreover, under the vaults of the family estate, the parents planned to force Aslaniya to return to her previous diet. The boy noisily closed the book he had been reading and looked in surprise at the guest who had entered. He was somewhat puzzled and did not hide his negative attitude. He called her a piglet and suggested that she had gotten lost, and instead of going to the butcher's room in the kitchen, had gone into his apartment, which he considered a big mistake. The girl was shocked by such insolence, but decided that she should not respond rudely to rudeness and thought about what to do next. Aslaniya came to the conclusion that if she had no other options for friends, then she would have to establish contact with this ill-mannered boy. 3 travelers were riding in a carriage. They were having a leisurely conversation and reminiscing about how one of them saved the other's life. Among the passengers was the Marquis of Baloo Appleton, who thanked his companion for his visit, as he had recently become quite lax and suffered from boredom and idleness. Opposite the man sat Duke Livinshirt with his daughter, and listened as the Marquis spoke about his unsociable son, and asked Aslaniya to befriend him, to which she agreed. The problem turned out to be that the boy was an impudent and rude young man who did not want to see or hear the girlfriend who was forced upon him, and he made all sorts of stupid remarks about her. The boy openly mocked her unsightly appearance and did not hide his contempt for the Duke's daughter. This certainly irritated Aslaniya, but it wasn't critical, and besides, the boy had the same name as the top boss from the game Fantastic Attraction, Juven Appleton. According to the rules of the game, the Steel Empress always looked down on people elevating herself above them, and in order to summon the last enemy, it was necessary to reproach the aristocrat for pride. The messenger of the dark forces who bore the name Juvena belonged to that category of people who received genuine pleasure from mocking the weak and defenseless commoners. His only strong desire in life was to gain even more power than he had at that moment, while he walked over heads and left mountains of corpses behind him. Often Appleton killed simply because he saw some minimal flaw in a person believing that weakness should be punished by death. His powerful magical abilities and endless evil have earned him a terrifying reputation as a bloody butcher known as the Messenger of Darkness. Aslaniya was seated at a table that was literally bursting with incredibly tasty and excessively caloric food. This was arranged on purpose, not without the participation of her parents. Instincts and old habits took hold of the girl for a moment, and she literally stared at the exquisite dishes placed in abundance around her. Mustering all her willpower, the Duke's daughter closed her eyes and clenched her teeth, furious at her father, who sat next to her and laughed at her inner struggle. However, the battle did not last long. The intoxicating aroma captivated her mind, and not remembering herself, the hungry girl literally pounced on the prepared dishes and ate them all, leaving the plates empty. After a long period of refusing food, this breakdown turned out to be as difficult a test for her stomach as jogging around the family mansion. At one point, she felt like her heart was going to stop. Meanwhile, the guests present ate slowly, leisurely, using their cutlery, and engaged in small talk on abstract topics. Carefully wiping their mouths with a napkin, they watched as the little girl couldn't control herself, and her father praised the unfortunate little girl for her excellent appetite. A few days after Duke Livensert's visit, Aslanaya was still continuing her unequal battle. Every time the girl found herself at the table, her consciousness was powerless before the mass of attractive dishes and treats. But as soon as she managed to leave the walls of the mansion, her willpower returned, and the heiress of the family began to torment herself with physical exercise, usually running. In fact, her life had turned into a vicious cycle where the pain of overeating was replaced by the torment of overexertion and fatigue, but Aslania still didn't understand how to break out of it. Unfortunately, all this abuse of my own body only tired my heart and worried my nerves, because my weight was stuck and refused to move in the desired direction. At the same time, with each passing day, the girl felt that she wanted to exercise less and less and wanted to eat more and more, which meant that the weight would soon begin to grow again. In her past life, her daily diet was planned by doctors and scheduled hourly, and all this time, a hunger for tasty but unhealthy food had been building up inside her, and now the gluttony was actively taking over. And every time Aslania thought she was about to overcome her craving for gluttony, the servants brought new food that smelled even better and was even harder to refuse. The girl felt that she was starting to give up ground and was losing a new battle every day, but she still hoped to win this war, no matter how difficult it was. In addition, the Duke's heiress felt that she was greatly hampered by the constant pressure from her parents, especially her father, before whom she always yielded and sometimes even dreamed of escaping. But that wasn't all, as the task from his parents to make friends with Juvin was impossible to complete, as the boy simply avoided or pretended not to notice Aslania. The girl watched him very carefully and even studied her friend to some extent, but she could not find the key to him so that he would change his attitude towards her. Moreover, the behavior of the Appleton heir was noticeably different from what she was used to seeing in the game she was familiar with. In fact, he was a different person, a lover of weighty tomes. The books the boy spent his entire days next to were clearly not appropriate for his age, as they didn't even contain funny pictures or other content that children love. Levensert's daughter noticed that the most frequently visited place in the mansion was the extensive library. Perhaps the clue to the boy's behavior lies there. Aslania followed him and surrounded him, trying to understand his behavior patterns and establish at least some kind of contact. But Juvin simply sat and read demonstratively, pretending that in front of him was not a man of his age, but merely an annoying misunderstanding. Once again, the girl approached the boy and tried to start a dialogue. She tried to be extremely polite and courteous. However, the teenager looked at his peer with a long, sad gaze and did not answer. He even stopped calling her names, believing that she was not even worthy of this attention. The prolonged pause ended in nothing, as Juvin simply moved his gaze from the girl's face to the pages of the book and then continued reading. But Aslania had no intention of giving up. She had been gentle and patient for too long, and now a plan had matured in her head, according to which she would awaken the power that lay dormant within the boy. To do this, she approached the Marquis's son even closer, and with a sharp movement snatched from his hands the large red book that the Appleton heir had been reading enthusiastically all this time. Then, the potential girlfriend leaned over the surprised boy and suggested they play an exciting game where they would have to compete against each other. The publication was dedicated to how one can easily kill an enemy without putting in much effort. It should be noted that Aslania had prepared for this moment. She had studied some materials in the library and was now more advanced in magical matters than before. More than others, the girl was interested in control magic because she needed such skills to solve pressing problems. The observant little girl noticed that Yuvin, more than others, was drawn to tomes on the topic of increasing one's own power, as well as gaining magical strength, which meant that the beast within him was already awakening. Aslania thought that while this boss was still just a child, he couldn't pose a danger, but apparently it was in childhood that his terrible insides were formed. This meant that the girl had to hurry, because every day of his lessons increased the risk of destroying all her plans for a happy new life in this world. And suddenly, an unusual idea came to her mind about how to fight the boy and defeat him without resorting to magic or special spells. The technique turned out to be incredibly simple and effective. Yuvin lay on the floor screaming in pain and resentment, and the one he had so often called rude names simply sat on top of him. Young Appleton was still very weak physically, and therefore could not resist the heavy load that pressed him to the floor, and the girl was already thinking about his mother. Sitting astride Yuvin, Aslania remembered his parent, the Marquise Astia, who was a very weak woman, often ill, and died suddenly while still young. The girl heard that pregnancy and childbirth had completely undermined the unfortunate woman's health, and she could no longer climb out of the abyss into which she had slid. The Appleton heir's mother died only a few years after the birth of her son, which undoubtedly influenced his future life. From the servants' conversations, the girl learned that while Astia was alive, Yuvin was a model of politeness, courtesy, and good nature. The boy smiled, laughed, and joked a lot, and was like all ordinary children who enjoy life and have fun at any occasion. The boy loved his mother very much and spent as much time with her as her progressing illness allowed. But from the day Astia's eyes closed forever, Yuvin changed dramatically, becoming a withdrawn, irritable, hot-tempered, and quarrelsome boy. And the boy remained in this depressed and angry state until this moment, and no one could cheer him up, make him laugh, or distract him from the grief in which the child's heart was drowning. The girl thought that her mother's death was probably the starting point that awakened the essence of the messenger of darkness in Astia's son and gave birth to a strong and cruel game boss. Then a new plan was born in the head of the failed friend, and she told the helpless boy that if he did not want to be friends with her, so be it, then she would be his older sister. Pressed down by an unbearable weight onto the red carpet, Yuvin began to complain that he didn't need any girlfriend, much less a sister played by Aslania sir, to which the girl replied that since he had lost in a fair fight, he could not express his opinion, but should only silently agree and accept the inevitable. Young Appleton screamed that there had been no battle, he had simply been unexpectedly pushed off the sofa and crushed under a bag of bones. The girl narrowed her eyes and replied that if he did not want to give up and admit his defeat, that was his right. Then with a sharp movement, she turned the boy's thin body to face her and grabbed his wrists, adding that she would not hit him hard. It was clear that the Marquis' heir was clearly not prepared for such a turn of events, because a mask of bewilderment froze on his face. And suddenly, the room was filled with uncontrollable children's laughter, mixed with despair, sobbing, and heart-rending wails. Yuvin begged Aslania to stop her torture and leave him, but she only smiled and continued watching the fragile child's body writhe under her weight. The girl said that she would stop only when he admitted defeat and agreed with her triumph, and until that moment, the uncontrollable tickling would continue. Without losing her temper, the Duke's heiress added that she really enjoyed hearing his laughter, and that the boy had been walking around with a sad expression on his face for too long. Seeing that the Appleton heir was beginning to hesitate, Aslania increased the pressure and sped up her movements. Yuvin was holding on with all his might, but his emotions were already reaching the very edge of his endurance, which meant the boy was seriously beginning to think about ending the torture at any cost. Finally, the young aristocrat filled the room with a piercing cry that he surrendered and begged for mercy. Meanwhile, the servants who were nearby were shocked to hear the young master laugh for the first time in many years. Not daring to approach the maids, began to cry, remembering the terrible loss the boy had to endure, having lost his beloved mother at such an early age. The servants also suggested that in this way, the Marquis's heir was expressing his joy at his new girlfriend, the Duke's daughter, but they simply did not see his face at that moment. After some time, the children came out into the blooming garden and approached a huge bush of blue roses that had blossomed several days ago. Aslania happily announced that if Yuvin wanted, They could repeat this competitive game at any time. The boy looked depressed and replied that it was a stupid idea, and he really didn't want to repeat it under any circumstances. Making a sly expression and picking a rose, the Duke's heiress remarked that from now on, he should call her Nuna and add some respectful words since she was older. Yuven shouted that this was complete chaos and that he did not intend to fulfill a single one of her conditions. The girl responded that the Marquis's heir should behave more modestly. Then Aslania supposed that being in such a beautiful garden among fragrant and wonderful flowers, and being in a terrible mood at the same time, it must be very sad. The Appleton heir froze mid-sentence. He really didn't like the situation he found himself in, but there was truth in the words of this unpleasant girl, and he felt it. After thinking for a moment, Yuven continued in a calmer voice, noting that no one had ever called these flowers by such beautiful names before. Standing in front of a huge bush of blue roses and holding one of its flowers in her hand, the Duke's heiress asked why they were not given due attention. Then Aslania brought the flower to her nose, inhaled its aroma, and repeated her question, adding that it was very strange not to call a spade a spade. At first, the boy stood and looked at this strange, fat, and unpleasant girl, who put him in an awkward position and made him feel his own weakness. But then Yuven suddenly felt a strange warmth spreading inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long, long time. Once upon a time, many years ago, a great distortion of magical space occurred in the world, which is called the First Distortion. Lawlessness and suffering left and right. According to ancient legends, it was during those times that a unique blue rose appeared, which had not existed before. Yuven finished his story by saying that the flowers had taken root well and were popular, but no one dared to call them beautiful since they were associated with the invasion of monsters. The girl didn't answer, but continued to stand and squeeze the stem of this mysterious flower with a difficult history in her plump palm. The boy asked if Aslania still considered these flowers beautiful after learning how they came to be in their world. The Duke's daughter replied that she knew this story, but had never found any evidence or confirmation that it was true, and therefore preferred to call beautiful flowers beautiful. Juven said that no one liked these flowers, and everyone spoke badly of them, and they remained in the garden only because his own mother planted them. On the eve of the birth, the condition of the Marchioness of Astia noticeably worsened, so the head of the Appleton family turned to a doctor for help to analyze his wife's condition. After performing the necessary manipulations, the doctor turned to Marquis Baloo and said that there was no way to save both the mother and the child at the same time, so the husband had to make a difficult choice. The specialist added that there is no time to waste, because time works against the health of both the mother and the unborn child. The Marquise had a very difficult decision to make, but the situation had developed in such a way that there were no other options, so he focused on the answer. Gathering all his courage, the man clenched his fist and gave the doctor an answer. However, despite the fact that all efforts were directed at saving only one family member, both survived. The first thing Astia said when she took the baby in her arms was the words "blue rose." She added that they should plant this flower around the estate as a reminder of the miracle that had happened. The Marquise tried to weakly object to his wife, that people would not understand such an act, but his wife gently insisted on her own, and Baloo did not contradict him. And since then, this unusual plant has settled on the territory of the Appleton family estate as a living reminder of the miracles happening in the world. Not everyone shared Astia's view of the miraculous healing that had taken place, but over time, people simply became accustomed to the blue color that filled the rooms and the courtyard. The simple servants resisted the longest. In their minds, the rose symbolized trouble and brought misfortune, so they always viewed their mistress's desire with condemnation. Yuven added that people speak well of the flower only out of respect for his deceased mother. But in reality, everyone tries to stay as far away from blue flowers as possible. Meanwhile, a butterfly of the same color flew up to the flower, and the boy added that he believed in the sincerity of Aslania's words and thanked her. The surprised girl accidentally scared away the insect and looked in amazement at her intended friend. She found this moment especially touching. The Marquis's heir continued saying that he tried not to mention his mother because it was difficult, but today the memories of her and the garden roses echoed in his heart, not with pain, but with warmth. The butterfly flew up to the flower again, probably attracted by the rich blue color, which harmoniously matched the shade of these light wings. A month passed slowly, and the day came when Aslania had to leave the Marquise estate and return home. The first thing the girl did was go to Juven's, and while the heiress of Duke Livensert hurried to her sworn friend, various scenarios for their meeting flashed through her head, but for some reason, most of them were negative. Over the past 4 weeks, the young lady had completely abandoned her diet, but she had managed to concentrate her attention on the boy and joyfully shouted that she was leaving when she literally burst into his room. However, the young aristocrat was not in the library, although all the days before he began his morning with books, now only the maid was here. The girl bowed respectfully to the heiress of the noble family and said that the young master was not here. The maid then went on to say that Juven had gone to a place that was not usually spoken about out loud, but Aslania still didn't understand anything. Seeing the confusion on the girl's face, the maid added that this place was located somewhat away from the house and prying eyes. There, on a hill in the shade of a small tree and surrounded by nature, lies the grave of Astia, the mother of the Appleton heir. The duke's daughter asked in surprise why Juven had gone there today and not another day, to which the girl replied that today was the birthday of the deceased Marquise, which her son never misses, and always visits his mother. The servants saw the young master heading exactly there, as he had done all the previous years. The maid also added that Juven took with him a bouquet of blue roses, which the Marquise loved. Aslania thought that her son wanted to honor the memory of his deceased mother and give her favorite flowers, which she associated with miracles. The boy had almost reached his destination when he suddenly heard someone's voice behind him. It seemed to him that someone called him by name. He looked around the area again carefully, but saw no one. Deciding that he had imagined it, Juven turned around and set off again. He knew this road well. The Appleton heir walked slowly up the hill to its summit, covered with lush green grass, occasionally skirting the sparse trees. The boy's hearing did not deceive him. Someone had indeed been following him and watching him for some time. Soon, the silhouette of the man pursuing him appeared behind the foliage. The huntress had almost tracked down her target, but getting to her turned out to be not as easy as she had first thought. The thing is that the climb was incredibly difficult for the girl. Every step up the mountain echoed in her ears. Aslania even picked up a stick to lean on like a walking stick, but it was of little help. The low hill turned out to be a serious obstacle in her path. The duke's heiress remembered a maid who had spoken of this mountain as a small elevation that could be easily climbed in just a few minutes. Every movement was incredibly difficult, but the young lady was not one to give up easily, and suddenly she saw a petal of a familiar color under her feet. And a little further, right in the grass, lay the bouquet of blue roses. The girl wondered what could have made the boy throw away his mother's favorite flowers. Aslania stopped to catch her breath and began to carefully examine the find. It turned out that the flowers had not been placed there, but simply thrown away. The duke's heiress did not yet know what had happened, but her guesses were the worst, and suddenly she realized that she had to act, threw down her stick, and rushed to the very top. It was hard to walk and incredibly difficult to run, but the girl overcame the pain in her side and moved forward quickly and inexorably. Suddenly, Aslania stopped dead in her tracks, because she never expected to see this picture in front of her. Juven sat on the ground, and above him towered a huge bony monster that had appeared out of nowhere on the Marquise's estate. The monster was terrifying and disgusting, waving its terrifying claws and long tail right in front of the child's face, and purple slime was dripping down its head. The duke's heiress did not understand how this was possible, and did not know what to do because confronting such a powerful opponent in her condition was tantamount to suicide. But something else was more important. What exactly did the monster want? Why did he come here, and what were his true goals? Why did he attack the boy? Meanwhile, the monster's bony tail began to wrap around the boy's head. This did not bode well, rather the opposite. And then a strong and powerful hand of a mystical creature reached out to Uvini. The young gentleman looked at the approaching threat as if fascinated and did not even try to do anything. And a moment before, the dark paw of an unseen beast fell upon the fragile child's body. Aslania rushed towards the boy and covered him with her body. Then the bright colors of the world quickly faded, and everything was plunged into some strange twilight. The girl's light hair fluttered in the wind, but its owner did not notice this. Her consciousness was now far away. She thought that if she didn't stop the monster from killing Yuven, then many years later she would be freed from having to fight the boss called the Dark Envoy. However, her body began to react against her will, and therefore rushed to save her friend, who was now unharmed. The Marquise's heir held Aslania's limp body in his arms and could not believe what was happening. According to the plot of the game, Fantastic Attraction itself, Juvan Appleton was supposed to be the final and most dangerous boss. But the time spent together was not in vain, especially for the girl, as she felt that she had a real younger brother, albeit with a difficult character. In her past life, Aslania dreamed of having a brother, and over the years she has become attached to the boy with all her heart and soul. But a terrible monster stood in her way to happiness, and she could not stay away. Soon consciousness began to return, and the young heiress of the Duke began to tell Juven that he should run away. The boy was shocked and could not say or do anything. It felt as if the boy had fallen into a stupor. The little heir's head was filled with the thought that he had made a mistake, because this ugly girl had just proven that she could be a strong and loyal friend. Juven was impressed by the fact that Aslania had just rushed forward and risked her life for the sake of some stranger. The Marquise's heir immediately remembered the words of his mother, who before her death asked him to be strong when she was not around. Many times the boy heard the servants whispering and discussing the death of Lady Aslania, and then they usually blamed the boy for the tragedy. The boy thought about how one can remain strong if one has caused the death of a loved one. Juven had read a great number of wise books and knew how important it was to have a strong body, a developed spirit, and an unbending character. The books offered a lot of different advice on all aspects of life, and the boy gradually absorbed it all, though he considered physical development to be the easiest. But in ancient tomes and modern sources, nothing was said about training the soul. And every time remembering his mother, the child cried, unable to cope with the rolling waves of heavy emotions, and drops of bitter tears flooded the pages. Suddenly, she appeared in his life, a fat girl with a loving heart, whom he rejected in every possible way, but she still managed to find the key to his soul. Aslania was full of flaws, from her food addiction to her plump appearance, but the girl always strived for something, even if she had no chance of winning, or any success the Duke's heiress tried under any circumstances. However, having found herself in a critical situation, she reacted without hesitation in the way she considered correct, and now Juven was left alone with the monster one-on-one. The boy stared wide-eyed into the monster's tiny eye sockets and didn't know what to do. The young gentleman remembered well his mother's words about being strong, but he didn't understand what exactly he should do in such a situation. Then Aslania's words came into his head, telling him that he needed to get out of here as quickly as possible. All this time, he considered her weak, helpless, and useless, but everything turned out to be quite the opposite. The boy ran his hand through the girl's hair. She no longer seemed as disgusting and vile to him as before, and he thought that the friend he had forced on her was indeed stronger and better than him. Then Juven remembered his mother and realized that the bravest thing a person can do is to give up his life for someone else. This is exactly what the Duke's heiress did when she shielded the boy from the clawed paw of the sinister monster. And now the young gentleman was able to gather in his head the complete picture that he lacked. For a true understanding of the nature of human strength, he thanked the girl and raised his hand in the direction of the monster. The dark creature had been patiently watching the proceedings all this time, and even tilted its head to better examine the change that had taken place in the boy. To the monster's surprise, the boy's hand suddenly became very big, and he tried to block out this powerful energy, but it was too late. Unable to resist the flow of the powerful element, the alien from another world cried out in pain and felt himself being squeezed from all sides by strong fingers. He couldn't resist or even move his strong arms or bony tail. It was as if a dark, dense cocoon had enveloped him from all sides and compressed him to microscopic dimensions, subordinating him to someone else's will. Then, Juven clenched his fist with all his might and crushed the monster along with its trap, thus sending it on a return journey to where the stranger had arrived in our world from. After defeating the darkness, the Marquise's heir returned to Aslania. Fortunately, she was not harmed, but only lost consciousness, and was now in a state of deep and carefree sleep. The boy looked at his friend with warmth and thought that now his life would be completely different, because if she had not risked her life, then surely he would have grown up to be who knows what. The monster overwhelmed his will and bound his mind with its unexpected visit, so that Juven became confused and showed weakness, although his knowledge was sufficient to deal with the enemy. The Marquis's heir recalled that all the years spent studying books turned out to be useless as soon as fear gripped his body. The fact is that all this time, the boy lived with a feeling of guilt for the death of his mother, which destroyed him from the inside and made him weak. But now everything has changed. Now Juven realized that there are things in the world worth living for, and his new friend helped him understand this, for which he was very grateful to her. After which, the teenager remembered the bouquet of blue roses thrown during his escape from evil spirits. Now they became a symbol of miracle, not only in the life of his mother, but also in the fate of his son. In the main hall, a solemn farewell was held for the family of Duke Levenshurt, whose month-long visit had come to an end. Along with other members of the family, Juven also came out to see the guests off. He was now a completely different person than he had been a month ago, with a smile shining on his face and clarity and confidence in his gaze. Aslania was very pleased that she had managed to solve this problem, albeit in such a risky way, and the girl was also happy that the boy began to call her Nuna as she wanted. They parted truly as friends, and the Duke's heiress was so pleased to see young Appleton smile that she invited him to stay with them. Finally, Juven asked the young aristocrat to describe the image of the ideal guy that had formed in her head by that moment. Nuna thought about it. It was a sudden and very difficult question. However, she immediately began to list the criteria that her ideal should meet. The first thing the Duke's heiress remembered was muscles. There must be a lot of them, and a man must literally ooze health, strength, and power. In second place were internal qualities, such as kindness, caring, responsibility, politeness, and a beautiful smile, to which Juven promised that he would become just like that. One day, Aslania fell ill. This happened even before her visit to the Marquis's mansion and meeting the Appleton family. But this was no simple disease, but a magical fever that some children suffer from in their teens. At that time, the girl was 11 years old, and the illness overtook her right in the middle of the night in bed, when for several hours her body underwent mystical transformations. When the unpleasant sensations passed, the girl realized that a magical essence had awakened within her, and she was now on the path of magic. It was at this moment that a teenage girl who had died somewhere in a parallel reality was transported into the body of Aslania Levenshurt and became who she is now. After some time, having become accustomed to this world well known to her from the game's plot, the young sorceress came to her father and told the Duke that a magical gift had awakened within her. The parent, who was drinking aromatic tea at the time, was surprised and delighted at the same time. He asked why she hadn't told him about this before, since fever progresses differently in children. Then the man became a little angry because the girl hid her condition from her parents, which usually should have been observed and controlled from the outside. But after Aslania explained that it was a very quick and practically painless fever, the father relented and lifted his daughter high up. He began to spin the girl from side to side, causing more discomfort than during the previous illness. The young sorceress thought that sometimes it was better not to have any gift and to live a quiet, simple life without attracting the attention of evil monsters and without touching the dangerous elements. However, Aslania soon realized that it was better to use all available opportunities and resources to plan her actions as intelligently as possible, and therefore magical knowledge could really help her. The father leaned over his beloved daughter and offered to test her magical abilities in order to understand what element had been dormant in the young sorceress all this time. The Duke led the girl to a large crystal ball resting on a satin pillow and told her to place her childish hands on its smooth surface. The artifact responded even before Aslania had time to touch it. A bright light green hue appeared in its depths, which surprised her father. The head of the Levenshurt clan was shocked by how strongly the attribute reacted to his daughter's magical abilities. As a result, the ball revealed a powerful magical gift called Enhancement, and then the Duke promised that he would find a suitable teacher for his beloved daughter. After some time, the father called the heiress to him and showed her a guy dressed in high brown boots with straps. It was a stately and strong young man named Bertrand Schumann. He thanked the noble family for the honor bestowed upon him and introduced himself as a mentor of the magical craft. Aslania looked at this broad-shouldered, handsome man and could not believe her eyes. She still knew nothing about this teacher, but she had already literally fallen in love with him. The mentor smiled and said that he was glad to become a magic trainer for the young lady, and that they would begin magical exercises soon. The Duke's heiress still could not utter a word. She was so shocked by their acquaintance that she literally fell into a stupor. All Aslania could do at that moment was look at Bertrand, with her mouth open in amazement, and repeat his name in her head. Finally, the young sorceress somehow overcame her confusion and replied that she too was very pleased to meet you. After which, the young sorceress asked when their long-awaited training would begin, to which the guy laughed and praised her for her thirst for knowledge. Suddenly, Schumann squatted down and began to examine his charge most carefully. She did not understand what was happening. Looking at the surprised Aslania, Bertrand said that before starting magical practices, one should prepare a little and do some things. The next phrase from the attractive teacher literally knocked the teenager out cold. It followed that the student's weight was 38 clés and her height was 136 cm, and such proportions were an obstacle to learning. Squinting and folding his arms across his chest, the mentor noted that her magical potential far exceeded her physical development, which meant she needed to get her body in order. Right before the eyes of the astonished Father Schumann, said that the girl needed to go on a diet, but losing weight on the grounds of the mansion was simply impossible as it was too comfortable. Ignoring the Duke's intense gaze, Bertrand continued that it would only be difficult at first, but once his charge mastered the magic of enhancement, she would be able to convert what she ate into mana, and the excess weight would disappear forever. Aslania looked at the teacher and couldn't believe her ears, because he was offering her a way to escape obesity, and at the same time giving her hope for a return to hearty meals. Having mastered the techniques of strengthening a teenage girl, will be able to consume absolutely any volume of goodies while accumulating mana and maintaining a slim figure. Bertrand also added that her body would become not just thin, but graceful and toned, and at higher levels of development. Simply ideal, Aslania was literally exhausted with the desire to start as soon as possible. And after some time, grueling training began, during which the girl performed a lot of difficult exercises under the watchful guidance of Schumann. The young sorceress ran, jumped, climbed rocks, and in every possible way loaded her muscles with various movements. Thus, she stubbornly moved forward towards her goal. Sweat poured off the girl during push-ups, but this time her parents didn't interfere and allowed the instructor to do his job as well as possible. When Aslania's condition became really severe, and she literally fell on the grass from exhaustion, Bertrand gave her a special potion, created according to his recipe, and strength returned to her exhausted body. At first, the healing elixir was only added to the girl's diet. It was tasteless and disgusting, but the Duke's daughter believed in the results, and her mentor. Soon, the sorceress managed to completely switch to drinking the magic potion, completely giving up regular food so that internal processes would proceed more quickly. The magic teacher liked the attitude of his ward. She was not like other spoiled noble children, although she looked quite colorful. But it wasn't just Aslania who set this goal for herself. Schumann decided no matter what to turn his student into the best magician of all time. After just 1 month, the teenage girl was unrecognizable. She could do more than 100 push-ups without stopping. Bertrand was proud of the Duke's heiress's achievements and of his mentorship, as his plan was coming to fruition even faster than he had expected. The young lady could only be recognized by her blue clothes and eyes. The rest of the girl's body had undergone serious changes, having lost all the extra pounds. In addition, Aslania has noticeably grown and stretched out, and at the same time gained strength, firmness in her muscles, and confidence in her actions. Now, the young sorceress looked in the mirror with pleasure, not with disgust, and watched as she acquired an ideal form every day. In just 1 month, she lost weight, regained her health, and gained endurance, which allowed her to perform a lot of complex exercises, although now they seemed easy and enjoyable to the girl. A gilded carriage was moving from the Marquis of Appleton's estate towards the Duke of Leavenshurst's mansion, with 2 people sitting in it. The young heir of the family accompanied his father on the trip, and was very happy that he would soon see the very girl who changed his whole life, and for the better. Baloo was pleased to see his son in such a good mood, so he said that the boy would be very surprised when he saw Aslania, because a lot had happened during this month. Juven was bringing his girlfriend Nuna a bouquet of blue roses, the very ones that had played such an unusual role in his life, and he believed that she would definitely like this gift. The boy remembered her plump face, but he was not at all embarrassed by her size, because he knew what a kind and faithful heart beat in her chest. At this time, it was time for the next grueling workout, during which Aslania did push-ups. Noticing that the exercise was coming too easily to the student, Bertrand decided to make the technique a little more difficult and sat right on the young lady's back. Schumann tried to pretend that he did not notice the outstanding successes of his protégé, but deep down, he never ceased to be amazed by her achievements and fantastic progress. Moreover, the teacher was able to control his own weight and therefore gradually added kilograms to his body so that his 120 kilos turned into 700. And despite such a gigantic significance, which would undoubtedly have killed an ordinary person at the start, Aslania performed push-ups again and again. Even Bertrand, an experienced trainer, felt uneasy under such a load, but he patiently allowed the girl to complete the exercise to failure. Yes, in front of him now was not that plump little girl, unable to deny her belly a portion of sweets. Now it was a strong and powerful beast. At the end of this new training session, the Duke's heiress literally stopped feeling her body, and for a moment it seemed to her that Schumann had finally flattened her, but the instructor continued to joke. Meanwhile, Juven was walking along the garden path, and what he saw made him immediately drop the bouquet of blue roses. And then the young master rushed to his Nuna to find out how she was feeling. But realizing that in front of him was a magic mentor who was explaining his methods to a student, the boy froze in indecision, not knowing how best to act so as not to interfere. Suddenly, Bertrand was forced to interrupt his training because he heard a strange noise behind him. It turned out that it was Juven who had exerted his dark magical power. It seemed to him that this man was treating his beloved Nuna too harshly and without the slightest respect. Turning around, Schumann was shocked because he realized that in front of him stood a cold-blooded killer who could use terrible witchcraft against him. Getting up from Aslania, who was sprawled on the ground, the mentor tried to explain that this was all just training, but he realized that it was too late and prepared to repel the attack. It was difficult to withstand the onslaught of dark magic. It was reinforced by teenage aggression and a thirst for justice. Bertrand thought that this was probably the young heir of the Appleton family. While fending off the attacks, the teacher began to wonder why the boy had dropped the bouquet and started throwing spells at him. Then Schumann remembered that the young gentleman had shouted Nuna's name before starting his unjustified aggression. Then Bertrand shouted for the boy to stop, because his name was probably Juven, the one Aslania had been talking about so much lately. For some time, dark spells still flew from the figure of the Appleton heir, and his eyes, burning with flame, expressed only one desire: death. But suddenly, the meaning of what the mentor said finally reached the magician's consciousness, and in an instant, he changed both in his face and in his actions. And now, before Schumann, stood no longer a cold-blooded and ruthless dark magician, but a timid young man in love who tremblingly caught every word of his teacher Nuna. Bertrand recounted how much Aslania talked about her friend from the Appleton family when she was relaxing after sports and magical practices. In fact, the student never told the teacher about Juven, but the experienced mentor, seeing the bouquet of flowers and the teenager's reaction, decided to play ahead and turned out to be right. The boy was in love. It was literally red on his embarrassed face, and the red blush that appeared on his cheeks after he found out that Nuna was thinking about him and talking about him out loud. The experienced master immediately took the naive boy into his lap, promising to tell him some details from his dialogues with Aslania that related to his person. Leaving the girl to deal with the aftermath of the training on her own, Bertrand led the young gentleman away from the scene of their recent battle because he wanted to defuse the situation as quickly as possible. And while the budding sorceress was slowly coming to her senses, Schumann said that his student had the deepest and most tender feelings for the heir of Appleton, as if he were her own brother. Juven was happy to hear these words, and then admitted that she really acted like a wise and strong older sister, and he was a stupid and weak boy. The Marquise's heir placed complete trust in this intelligent and experienced man who was so close to his beloved Nuna and knew so much about her. Then Bertrand added that Aslania always believed in the boy, that he would grow up and become a very good and strong person. Seeing that the boy was very easy to contact, Schumann assumed that she thought so much about him because she liked Juven, but Aslania was just afraid to admit it. Suddenly, the Marquise's son perked up and asked his mentor why he used such brutal methods in training, since it was difficult to, which Schumann replied that there was no other way. Bertrand explained that enhancement magic has its own characteristics and cannot be developed without tedious training. Moreover, if approached incorrectly, it can cause a dangerous disease, after which the mentor looked at the blue sky with white clouds and added that he believed in her, as she was a very capable and goal-oriented girl. Then Schumann warned Juven that what was said between them today must remain a secret, otherwise Aslania would stop trusting her mentor and sharing her thoughts about the boy with him. And in the end, Bertrand concluded that if the student had no one to discuss the Marquise's son with, she would stop thinking about him, to which the boy immediately responded, assuring him that he would keep everything a secret. Thus, the clever teacher avoided all possible troubles and kindled the flame of true love in the young heart of the young master. After a short silence, Yuven began to look at the sleeping girl and asked when she would wake up from this deep and sleepless sleep, to which Schumann replied that this would happen as soon as her strength was restored. Training and practice continued all summer, and outside the window the trees had already turned yellow, and the forests had replaced their green colors and shades with yellow, red, and orange. Stepping on the scale, Aslania was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief, as her new weight was 33 klien, which she considered ideal. Despite his serious physical training and the presence of incredibly strong and firm muscles, this was practically not manifested in any way outwardly. Such was the magic of the enhancement. The exercises led to the fact that now, this fragile-looking teenage girl could lift multi-ton stone blocks with one hand. The only thing the Duke's heiress regretted was that after finishing her studies, she and Schumann would have to part, even though she had become so accustomed to him. Aslania was somewhat consoled by the fact that now any heights were within her reach, and she could easily stand up for herself or even protect someone if necessary. The young sorceress looked to the future with confidence, because she had learned to overcome difficult challenges, which meant that life would now be simpler and easier. Meanwhile, Juven was also not lagging behind. Several months ago, magical abilities appeared in him, and he was slowly developing them. Nuna tried to guide and support any kindness in his heart, because she knew that according to the game's plot, he could become the most terrible villain in the world. Aslania was proud of herself because she was confident that as long as she was nearby, she would be able to control and restrain his aggression, as well as direct the dark force into a peaceful direction. However, Juven was a sweet and modest boy, only in appearance. There was another side of the teenager that was not accessible to everyone. It turns out that Schumann not only taught the Duke's heiress, but also imparted important life lessons to the Marquise's son, teaching him when and how to show or hide strength. Bertrand taught that power should be hidden deep within a man, and that what should be displayed is something funny and harmless that will evoke a smile and affection. The young master felt a little awkward, constantly wearing the mask of a weak and helpless boy who was fascinated by all sorts of children's games and animals. The mentor said that one should pretend to be weak until Juven's height surpassed Aslania's, and then one could reveal oneself in all its glory and demonstrate one's strength. This tactic seemed very complicated, inconvenient, and time-consuming in the eyes of the teenager, but Bertrand insisted that this was the best way to win the heart of his beloved. One day, the Marquis's heir entered the room of a teenage girl while she was sitting at the table and asked what she was doing, to which he replied, "She was looking in the mirror." Juven laughed and suggested that Aslania didn't need a mirror at all, since she was so beautiful that she didn't even need to check it. The Duke's heiress was very pleased to hear such words, and she was once again convinced what a good guy he really was. The children were filled with joy. They came up to each other and began to laugh and hug each other cheerfully. Aslania blushed and asked if she was more likable now that she had lost the extra pounds, and Juven replied that he enjoyed her company regardless of the number on the scale. The young sorceress asked him again if he really thought so, to which the young gentleman replied that she was always as beautiful as a fresh flower. In Nuna's mind, when just a few months ago this possible messenger of darkness called her a fat pig and constantly ignored her, the sorceress was a little confused that despite all the changes, her eyes remained the same, and she saw in them a villain who should turn into a negative boss in the late stages of the game. However, against the backdrop of other changes and the restoration of health of the entire body, this detail seemed small and insignificant, especially when Juven was nearby. The sun blinded the room with its bright rays, and the children decided to go for a walk on this clear, fine day. Suddenly, the girl picked up the guy in her arms as if he were a feather and carried him towards the exit of the room. The Marquis's heir tried to stop her, but she didn't listen to him. During another meal in the dining room, under a beautiful chandelier, the father told his daughter important news that they were invited to a reception in Huangxiang. The girl asked him to tell her the details. It turns out that the crown prince will soon have a birthday, and the aristocratic families close to the court will be there as guests. Aslania recalled that according to the game's plot, one of the final bosses was the first prince. Rudenvan von Heinberg, or simply Ruden. This tall, handsome blond man, with a permanent sly smile on his face, was one of the three most difficult opponents in the fantastic attraction. In the final stages of the game, the heir to the imperial throne was distinguished by his striking appearance and serious influence. But now he was only 11 years old. Despite his young age, the crown prince mastered several magical elements at once, but his leading and primary one always remained light in all its manifestations. Rudenvan could have become the greatest hero of all time, famous for his good deeds and accomplishing great things, but his bad character ruined everything. While gobbling up the fragrant cupcakes, Aslania remembered that his appearance was as beautiful as his contents were terrible. To awaken this boss, it was necessary to fulfill only one condition: to eclipse his image with the glory of his own hero, since Heinberg could not tolerate anyone on the Olympus of popularity. The Duke's daughter really didn't want to face this monster in a beautiful shell, but she understood that their meeting was inevitable. Well, the main thing was to look worse than him. The young sorceress lay on her bed, wondering how she should behave so as not to inadvertently attract unnecessary attention from those around her, and not alienate the prince from his fame. Before the planned visit, maids came to Aslania's chambers to help the Duke's heir choose an outfit befitting her position. The girl really looked good. Her light clothes matched harmoniously with the color of her hair and eyes. The young sorceress became embarrassed and thanked the girls, but to herself she thought, why are the beautiful outfits so uncomfortable and impractical? In an elegant carriage, young aristocrats were traveling to celebrate the birthday of the heir to the throne. Aslania asked if her friend had ever been to such events, to which the boy replied in the negative since he was too young. The Duke sitting opposite remarked that this would be the first reception of this level for the children, but they should not worry, they were so sweet that nothing would happen to them. And while the carriage drawn by a pair of horses was driving through the picturesque expanses, the father told his daughter that many of the guests already knew about her, so she would not be lonely. Catching his daughter's puzzled look, the head of the family smiled at his wife, who was sitting next to him, and took several photographs out of the inside pocket of his jacket. The man then handed over one of the cards and showed his daughter the photo accompanying it with a comment along the lines of, "What a wonderful girl we have." When Aslania saw her picture, she was shocked because it wasn't just an old photo, but the very one where she looked disgusting. Holding the card in her hands, the girl literally lost the power of speech because there she was again, fat, weak, and sick. The father handed over a few more photos and added that he tried to capture the most colorful moments in the life of his heiress when she was only 9 years old. The images were truly varied, and in each one, Aslania looked very happy and enthusiastic. However, the theme of the photographs was united not only by the presence of a fat and contented girl, but also by the obligatory presence of dishes being destroyed, meat sweets and others. Putting the cards back in place, the father said that he really liked it when his little girl ate so well, and therefore he tried to warn the guests about the visit of such a gluttonous child to the party. The young lady was shocked that she had been disgraced even before her physical arrival at the celebration, and asked how many people had seen the photo, to which the Duke replied that he had literally sent out a message to every single nobleman who had been invited to the emperor's court that day. The young sorceress looked at her father proudly, telling how many letters he had sent and how many photographs had been distributed throughout the kingdom, and she could not believe what was happening. Aslania sat in the carriage and did not understand why she was being punished like this, because that dark and thick page of her biography had been turned over, and she was going to live a completely different life. A dangerous thought arose in the little sorceress's head that her father would pay dearly for this terrible act, but this would not happen now, but over time. There were a lot of guests at the reception, but Prince Rudenvan thought that for the most part they were all boring and secondary characters that he didn't care about at all. The future emperor sat on the sofa and looked at the original and stylish outfits of those gathered, and thought that they were all trying so hard only to please his eyes. The boy openly stated that his radiance cannot be eclipsed, because it is impossible, because in this world there is only one main character. Him and everyone else is just there for the background. A tall elderly man appeared next to Heinberg and politely asked the crown prince if he had learned the names of all the guests, to which the young man replied that it was easy because he had a super memory. Then Rudenvan complained that the arriving guests were tiring him with their long congratulatory speeches. He wanted to finish the formal part faster, Indeed, every nobleman invited to the palace considered it obligatory to express his wishes as elaborately and beautifully as possible, so the process dragged on. When the Duke of Livenshire's arrival was announced, the Crown Prince no longer even looked ahead, but closed his eyes and dozed, leaning back on his sofa, mechanically answering those present. And only when the butler, following the names of his parents, Leon and Helen, called Aslania's name, the smug teenager perked up and sat up straight. Since such events are often boring, those gathered always find something to gossip about, and thanks to the Duke's dispatch, everyone was eagerly awaiting his daughter. As soon as the aristocrats crossed the threshold of the hall, all conversations fell silent, and everyone's gaze turned to the young girl, whom everyone knew from photographs, and now everyone around was delighted with her appearance. The young sorceress understood that her plan to remain as quiet as a mouse had failed miserably, and she was also ashamed in front of all these people for her gluttony. However, hearing so many muffled, enthusiastic speeches was very pleasant, and after just a few seconds, Aslania's mood began to improve. The heir even stood up from his seat in surprise, which had never happened before. He thought that all these photos of the fat sweet tooth were just her father's way of protecting his daughter from the evil eye. Heinberg decided that the photographs could not belong to the Duke's daughter because it was impossible for such a powerful transformation to occur so quickly. Then Rudenvan caught himself thinking that he really liked her, and therefore she could very well join him for some entertainment. In his childish imagination, the Crown Prince immediately began to draw pictures of their future together, and with each episode, Aslania began to take up more and more space in them. The guests froze and looked towards the heir to the empire, who not only rose from his seat, but also headed straight towards the Duke's daughter, which spoke of His Highness's highest favor. Coming even closer, Heinberg stopped and looked closely at the young guest. Up close, she seemed even better to him than from afar. He had seen many girls in his kingdom, but only Aslania had captured his soul and charmed him at first sight. Rudenvan already believed that she was worthy of being his mate. For a few seconds, the Duke's heiress held out hope that this terrible man had come out to meet someone else, but the Crown Prince called her by name, and everything collapsed. The heir to the empire smiled, raised his hand, and loudly said that this girl now belonged to him, while the guy looked as if he was buying a toy in an expensive store. Those present were amazed by the pressure of the future emperor, who made his choice so quickly. The Duke and Juven were also shocked by the event that had happened. They clearly did not expect that Aslania would cause such a sensation, and that it would have such consequences. The young sorceress did not know what to answer, and only made an indistinct sound of surprise. The Crown Prince was clearly pleased with the effect his words had produced. He broke into a smile, folded his arms across his chest, and repeated his question, adding that the girl must agree immediately. Aslania politely replied that she was still very young and had not thought about marriage, to which the heir to the empire closed his eyes and remarked that he understood how shocked she was by his proposal, which meant that she agreed. Heinberg continued to smile and assumed that the Duke's daughter was simply shy in his company, but inside he was very surprised that she did not rush to thank him for such a gift. Meanwhile, Rudenvan continued to insist and suggested that turning down an engagement with the most successful guy in world history would be an incredible mistake. However, Aslania closed her eyes and said that she would prefer to remain unmarried. Then the heir to the empire came closer, grabbed her hand, and pulled her along with him. But no matter how hard he tried to pull her, saying that he wanted to take the Duke's daughter into a new worthy life, the boy couldn't do anything. His Highness was surprised and shocked. It seemed to him that he was trying to move not a fragile girl, but a stone statue. To top it all off, the sorceress carefully took the prince's wrist with her other hand and lifted it up, thus freeing herself from the grip. Heinberg was shocked by the strength of the Duke's daughter and her incredible power, which struck him to the depths of his soul. Then the Livenshirt heiress put her hand to her chest and said she had no plans to get engaged, get married, or even date. And when the prince asked the reason for her refusal, Aslania, without hesitation, answered that she did not like him, and these words sounded like a bolt from the blue. Everyone around was shocked by what happened, but the birthday boy himself was the most shocked, because in his entire life no one had dared to contradict him so brazenly. Rudenvan shouted in rage, "How dare she refuse the most important character in this universe?" To which the girl replied with a smile that His Highness was mistaken. The young sorceress put on a serious face and added that the Crown Prince was certainly a striking figure, but he couldn't be called the main character, because the world around us was not a theater stage. The boy felt the ground slipping out from under his feet, and more quietly asked how it could be that he was not the center of everything that was happening around him. Aslaniya glanced around the hall, decorated with all sorts of elegant decorations, and replied that Heinberg could only be considered the most important person in his own life until someone fell in love with him. The crown prince began to become gradually filled with rage and asked how she dared to lecture him, to which he received the answer that one day Rudenvan would occupy the emperor's seat and therefore deserved only the truth. But anger and resentment had already begun to boil over, and the heir began to yell, ordering the girl to shut up immediately. The boy added that he had been mistaken about the duke's daughter. In fact, she was an empty shell and should answer for her rudeness towards a member of the royal family. Then Heinberg extended his hand towards the sorceress and began to cast a spell, saying that he was the greatest and most important of all existing characters. Finally, the prince's hand finished preparing, and a magical blow of light flew towards the frozen sorceress. The blow should have landed right in the chest of the brave girl, as indicated by the cloudy mark covering her clothes. A chain of pure light tightly entangled Aslaniya's body, and she had to strain with all her available strength just to cope with this pressure. Rudenvan used one of the most powerful and terrible spells in this world, Capture of Light, on the duke's daughter. In a past life, while playing Fantastic Attraction, Aslani's soul had already seen this ending. It could only be avoided by using special attributes that she did not have. And while the heiress of Livenshirt was thinking with annoyance about her hasty words and unenviable position, someone's shadow stood between them, and a hand covered the shackled sorceress. It was Yuvan. He stepped forward and politely, but firmly, asked the heir to the throne to stop the attack, while dark energy began to accumulate behind his back. The crown prince looked at the small dark-haired boy in surprise and asked who he was and why he had decided to lecture the most important person in this world. The heir of the Appleton family replied that he would not allow his sister to be bullied, and asked His Highness to immediately leave the person close to him alone. However, Rudenvan only laughed and said that there were two bad heroes in front of him at once in response. Yuvan tensed up and began to cast a spell. Then Heinberg smiled and added that this is very good. Now he can show everyone his true strength and abilities as the main character. The very first blow knocked Aslaniya's defender off his feet and sent him flying, as he had only been practicing magic for a short time, and his abilities had only appeared a few months ago. It was painful for the duke's daughter to watch her friend fail, because she understood their levels and knew that the odds were clearly on Ruden's side. The young sorceress thought that her opponent was a whole year older than her, which meant he had more experience and had clearly trained with the best. Turning his back on Yuvan, who was lying by the column, the birthday boy joyfully addressed those around him and said that he had proven his strength as a warrior of light, which meant that he was the true main hero in this world. Aslaniya felt not only the pain from the chain that bound her, but also a rage rising deep within her for the harm caused to her adopted brother, Heinberg's attention, and said that His Highness had deigned to rejoice earlier than he should have. The crown prince noted that this was his first public reception, and he would be a little sorry to so rudely restrain such a sweet but rebellious lady. However, she deserved it. The next moment, anger overwhelmed the sorceress, and she put all her emotions into a powerful jerk that tore the chain of light into bright fragments. Rudenvan was dumbfounded to see his best practically unbreakable spell shatter into pieces. Frowning deeply, the duke's heiress moved swiftly towards the enemy, her eyes gleaming with the cold thirst for revenge she was about to carry out. The future emperor was so confused that instead of taking any defensive measures, he simply stood and watched Aslaniya approach. The young sorceress raised her thin arm, which now probably weighed a couple of 100 kilograms, and swung it hard. The slap was incredibly strong and powerful, and the sorceress accompanied it with the words that Ruden should no longer interfere in her life. Having received a heavy slap, the warrior of light and the main hero of this world instantly lost consciousness and passed out. However, the force put into the blow did not stop there. The birthday boy's body lifted off the ground and rushed at high speed into the nearest column, where it remained stuck to the amazement of those around. The sorceress raised her fist up and thought that never in her life had she felt such power inside herself. The next moment, the duke's heiress realized what she had done, because she could have held back her rage and only broken the chain instead of harming Heinberg in front of all the royal nobility. The deathly silence that had descended upon the guest hall was broken by the quick rustle of a royal robe and all present, as if on command, turned towards the monarch. He walked towards the throne, the emperor and ruler of everything in this world, leading a little boy by the hand. Aslania lowered her gaze and began to quickly figure out what awaited her now, because causing physical harm to the heir is a serious crime. The king's mantle depicted a red sun with rays diverging to the sides and a goat's head with 2 long horns. The emperor looked around at those present and asked why they had disturbed him with their noise and what was going on here. The ruler of the city and the entire country bore the name Renard von Heinberg, and his very appearance was enough to make his subjects fall to their knees and await their fate in horror. The king stopped his gaze on Aslania, paused a bit, and asked why such chaos was happening at this bright holiday. The young sorceress turned pale and recalled one of the game's endings, where guilty subjects were sent to eternal exile or hard labor because what she had done was quite tantamount to treason. And that's the best-case scenario, because the duke's heiress knew that there was also the death penalty, which her parents certainly didn't deserve. Suddenly, the young lady felt that she was losing control of her own body. It was now being controlled by someone else. A strange voice sounded in Aslania's head, telling her that she should calm down and trust him because he wanted to help her. The first suspicion fell immediately on the emperor because he stood directly in front of her and looked at the girl intently without taking his eyes off. The king also possessed magic. His element belonged to air. But what exact arsenal was available to the owner of this country, no one knew. A small boy stood next to the ruler, holding the elder's hand and pressing the other to his chest. It was Shaden von Heinberg Ruden's younger brother, who according to the game's storyline was supposed to be an attack-oriented character, but was clearly small and inexperienced at the moment. Aslania remembered the plot well, and therefore knew that there was constant struggle and hostility between the brothers, and even the positive ending was closely connected to their behavior. According to legend, the brothers were forced to fight as adults because they hated each other and wanted completely different futures for their country. The emperor once again cast an imperious glance at the nobles present and said that he asked for forgiveness for this incident, and that today's reception was over and everyone could go home. Left alone, the king laid out several scrolls in front of him and activated the magic ball lying on the red pillow. Renard contacted someone through magic, and then began to briefly describe the events that had taken place, trying to present everything in the most harmless light possible, like the kids were fighting. It's normal, it happens. Just recently before this conversation, the king scolded his son for his inappropriate behavior at the celebration. The emperor thought that his eldest son was a real pain, that power was turning his head, and that the scoundrel was ruining the reputation of their influential family. But the ruler did not know how to bring him to his senses. After a polite knock on the door, a butler named Alfred appeared on the threshold and said that an event had occurred that Ruden's father absolutely must know about. The respectful man with small glasses on his nose lowered his voice and added that, in his opinion, the young gentleman had fallen in love. The emperor expected anything from his disobedient son: another fight, unprecedented stupidity, or even intrigue against his own father. But this news shocked Renard. For several hours now, the boy had been lying in his bed, tormented by terrible internal experiences. With one hand, he held his cheek, on which he had received a hefty blow from Aslania's pood-sized palm, and recalled the events of the previous day. In his entire life, Ruden had never met girls like his new acquaintance. There were cowardly, flattering, or empty ones, but not a single one like the young sorceress. The teenager also thought that only the main character could challenge the main character and even destroy his most powerful and effective spell. Several years ago, when the crown prince was still a very young boy of 4 years old, his father began to prepare and train the heir to the throne. According to established tradition, children of the upper class could remain carefree children only for the first 4 years of their lives, after which their preparation for adulthood began. The teachers were genuinely delighted with how quickly the child mastered complex sciences and called him a true genius, a unique creation, and predicted an incredible future. At first, Ruden thought that the mentors were flattering him because of his high status, but one day he realized that this was not the case, because his brother Shaden could not boast of the same speed of learning. With each passing year, the boy saw himself overtaking his peers more and more quickly, and surpassing them in development in all disciplines and areas. And then, comparing himself with those around him, a dangerous thought appeared in the head of the heir to the empire: that he was the chosen one, The young nobleman was so overwhelmed by his own uniqueness that he could think of nothing else. The emperor's son slammed the book shut and came to the conclusion that the chosen person must have a special path, unlike the lives of other ordinary people. Shaden tried to distract his brother from his obsessive ideas and switch him to something simpler and more entertaining. However, Rudin delved too deeply into the abyss of his uniqueness, which began to negatively affect his interactions with ordinary children. And moving away from them, he became increasingly lonely. The heir to the throne felt as if a heavy burden had fallen on his fragile shoulders, pressing him to the ground and preventing him from raising his head high. The young prince walked along the corridors of the palace and could not find a place for himself anywhere, so strongly was he bound by an unknown force. And one day the boy felt incredible weakness and fever. He was struck by a magical fever. It turned out that Rudin had acquired a rather rare form of light magic, which is found in only 3% of people who master any element. The magic teacher told the crown prince's parents that they had acquired not just a unique child, but a true hero the likes of which had never been seen before. It was on that day that the budding wizard tried on his new status as a hero and believed in it sincerely and unwaveringly, the way people believe in the sunrise or sunset. And in the young head full of fairy tales, the image of a brilliant warrior immediately arose, fighting countless hordes of monsters and nightmarish creatures. From ancient legends, the boy knew about Yongun, a mighty knight endowed with light magic who defeated hordes of bloodthirsty enemies and drove out demons from the entire continent. This feeling of himself as a radiant hero became a guiding star for Rudin, which illuminated the path and pointed out the direction. But this bright light, which momentarily illuminated everything around, also had negative consequences for the growing heir. Star fever turned the wizard's head and forced him to exalt himself above others, completely closing his eyes to the real world. The emperor's son looked at the abilities that had opened up to him and became convinced of his own uniqueness, while the world around him became something like a legend in which there was only one main character. But feeling himself on top of the world, Rudin allowed himself to lower all other people down a notch and began to perceive others as background and secondary images. Moreover, his attitude extended not only to the children with whom the crown prince studied, but also to teachers and mentors. Moreover, even family members, his own mother and brother, ceased to be close to the crown prince and became insignificant. And even his own father, who was the emperor and ruler of the entire country, became for Rudin nothing more than a backdrop on his path as a chosen hero. The boy clearly suffered from a mental disorder because he perceived the world around him as a fairy tale, where only he mattered and everyone else was just fleeting shadows. His narcissism, endless bookish fantasies, contempt for others, as well as his sharp mind and powerful magic, created his reputation as a nasty and very dangerous person. And so when the boy was at the peak of his vanity and was firmly convinced that he was the center of the universe, the duke's daughter appeared on his path, who behaved like a real main character. The crown prince thought that in his entire life, no one had ever dared to hit him. Even his strong and powerful father had avoided physical violence, which meant that Aslanaya was special and also chosen. Rudin saw her menacing appearance and clenched fist before him. Although she hit him with her palm, the boy thought that in front of him was a truly unique angel in the flesh. Lost in the clouds of his illusions, the heir to the throne recalled her words, gestures, movements, clothes, and everything else that created this unique image, so different from other people. The young prince was increasingly inclined to think that he really wanted to talk to her again, to see the girl at least for a moment, and look into her vast eyes. Rudin thought that his behavior was truly unworthy of this incredible main character, so he had to show his best side at all costs. Meanwhile, the emperor quietly opened the door and looked at his son, who was tossing and turning in delirium on the bed. The boy looked clearly unwell. Alfred also joined his master and added that in all the years of caring for the young master, he had never seen him in such a state. The child only spoke of meeting Aslania. Suddenly, the calm king threw himself on his servant's neck and began to shake him and ask if his heir had really fallen in love with a representative of the Livensert family. The thing was that for many years, having climbed all the accessible peaks, Rudin had experienced practically no other emotions except boredom. And then suddenly, there was a real flurry of pain rage and everything else. Alfred calmly endured the shaking from his master and continued to talk about how love is a complex thing, and it can very well arise after emotional contact. But the king still found it difficult to believe that what was happening was real, so he himself could not stop but ask the same question in different words, not believing his ears. The court servant patiently and steadfastly endured the manifestations of his master's character, until suddenly a muffled groan was heard from the boy's bed, and Renard froze, stopping shaking. The king and the butler looked at Rudin. He was lying sprawled out on the blanket and dreamily saying Aslania's name, and also adding various words to it like beloved, darling, and others. The emperor assumed that his son had hit his head too hard during a recent magical brawl. However, Alfred insisted that this was how deep feelings manifested themselves in the heir to the throne, and that in each person they arose from different reasons. In response, Renard recalled this story in detail and lamented that how could a man like a woman who punishes him so cruelly? The servant listened patiently to his master and replied that such constructions were of course rare, but Rudin himself was a very unusual boy, which meant that it was entirely possible. A noise came from the boy's bed, and the father turned around abruptly. It turned out that his son had been listening attentively and was ready to answer the emperor himself. The crown prince said that while he certainly didn't like being hit, especially by a woman, he had never in his life felt such a strong attraction to a girl. The king silently left the boy's chambers. Alfred followed him and asked what was on his master's mind. Then the worried father stopped under a large chandelier and replied that from the next day, his son's lessons would have to be intensive with practically no breaks. Winter had arrived, and when January 5th arrived at Duke Livensert's estate, everyone was getting ready to celebrate Aslania's birthday. Duke Leon and Duchess Helene, dressed in formal attire, applauded their daughter and offered various pleasant congratulations on this bright day. The girl was very happy and gladly accepted the forest speeches addressed to her, and also thanked her father and mother for everything they had done for her. The reincarnated soul was truly happy because after it entered this body, it had never celebrated its name day with its loving family. Soon Juvan arrived. He also congratulated his beloved Nuna on her birthday and wished that all her dreams would come true on this day, to which the girl thanked her adopted brother. This year, Aslania turned 10 years old, which meant that next year she could enter the elite private school Yggdrasil. The young lady was also glad to hear that despite his young age, the Appleton heir would enter school in the same year as her because he had rare dark magic. While the immortal soul was still in the hospital, it memorized all the heroes' profiles, so it knew each one's biography and could use this knowledge for its own life. Duchess Helen smiled slyly and said it was time to open presents. Juvan asked Nuna to open his gift first, which turned out to be an exquisite obsidian ring that the boy had personally crafted. Aslania was amazed by the quality of the work and learned that the stone contained magical power that would notify its creator if any trouble happened to the girl. The young wizard created this artifact so that in case of danger, he could rush to the aid of his beloved friend. The next moment, the door opened, and the butler informed the duke that a guest had arrived, to which the owner of the mansion was surprised, because they did not expect anyone without an invitation. The servant announced the arrival of His Serene Highness the Crown Prince Rudin von Heinberg, who was waiting for the head of the Livenschert family in his office, where they met a few minutes later. The heir to the empire greeted the duke without any formalities and simply called him father, which greatly angered the man. For such unheard-of insolence, Aslania's father could easily have punished the impudent boy, but he was the king's son, which meant the wise man had to tolerate familiarity. The vassal smiled amiably and asked to be called Duke Leon. However, Rudin had no intention of giving in. He asked his interlocutor again, insisting on using the word father in their subsequent dialogue, after which the smile slid off Leon's face, and he repeated his refusal. The boy frowned and took a letter out of his inside pocket, saying that he had come here to deliver this message. But when the duke reached for the envelope, the emperor's son abruptly raised his hand and prevented Aslania's father from taking possession of the correspondence, saying that it was personally for his daughter. Leon even tried to use magical acceleration to get the envelope, but Rudin seemed to be prepared for such a scenario and reacted faster. Dodging the aristocrat's hand, the boy insisted that he wanted to deliver the letter to her personally, and to do this, he needed to see her. After a few minutes of such games, the duke was completely exhausted, and the little prankster just stood his ground, chuckling. Finally, Leon gave in and replied that he would bring his daughter into the office for an audience with the king's son. Rudin was very happy when he heard that he was recognized as the winner of this small duel. The boy was simply happy because after so many weeks of painful waiting, he was finally closer to his cherished goal, to his beloved. About a week ago, when the boy was lying on a book and trying to catch his breath, because the number of classes had increased many times over, his father came up to him and wanted to say something. The emperor placed a small envelope on the table next to Rudin's face and said that he should hand this letter over to Aslania Livenshurt personally so that the children could see each other at the same time. The teenager was simply in seventh heaven because this idea of the king was a wonderful opportunity to see the object of his dreams and longings. Looking at the beautiful porcelain teapot, the young man asked his parent what he should say to the girl, to which Renard replied that firstly, he should ask forgiveness for his actions. A few minutes later, the duke's daughter entered the office and asked why she had been called. The emperor's heir immediately perked up as soon as he saw Aslania. He wanted to correct his mistake and make amends as quickly as possible. But when their eyes met, Rudin immediately forgot everything and simply stood silently and smiled, continuing to admire this beautiful and gentle lady who was in no way inferior to him. However, the young lady did not share his feelings. With a serious expression on her face, she asked why His Highness had visited her modest estate. The duke's daughter believed that since the boy brought an envelope from the emperor himself, this meeting was formal, but the behavior of the heir to the empire turned everything into a joke. Rudin watched with horror as a lump rose in his throat and prevented him from making even a sound. This had never happened to him before because the boy became timid and embarrassed, which was unthinkable. For a long time, the king's son considered other people to be empty creatures, unworthy of words and emotions. At times, the crown prince even refused to speak to anyone but himself because he was the only one worthy of it. But now, reality had revealed his weakness, which meant he had sunk a step lower. The boy was brought out of his stupor by Aslania's stern voice, asking why he had come here, because with each passing minute, his visit was looking more and more like a stupid joke. The emperor's heir suddenly felt very small, literally insignificant, incredibly weak and defenseless. This feeling overwhelmed him, and he began to sob. At some point, the crown prince could no longer withstand the pressure and turned into a brown seal who could not speak but could pass the envelope, which he did. Aslania thanked the messenger, opened the envelope, and began to read the letter, written by the hand of the emperor of the kingdom of Isaac himself. The ruler had a beautiful and clear handwriting. In the letter, he shared his personal thoughts regarding the current situation and the condition of his son. It was noticeable how difficult it was for the king to write these lines in which he described the boy's complex character and said that he needed an experienced mentor, capable of keeping Rudin under control. It turns out that the man had watched their duel with interest on the day of the reception and was surprised and delighted that there was at least one person willing to knock some of the empire's heir's arrogance down a notch. The ruler spoke about the fate of the entire kingdom being in Aslania's hands, and then came permission to use physical force against Rudin and the need to inform the emperor. Instead of answering, the girl squeezed the letter tightly and crumpled it in her hand, causing shock and awe in the embarrassed boy. The duke's daughter looked at the game's future final boss and began to think through her next plan of action as she now had a chance to fix it. Aslania thought that, judging by his reaction, he could easily be manipulated and directed in the right direction, as had been the case with Juven, and besides refusing the emperor, meant bringing troubles upon the family. But the sorceress was not afraid of the wrath of the country's ruler, but of the fact that, having risen above everyone, she risked summoning the final boss, which was completely unnecessary for her, which meant that she had to take on the re-education of Rudin. According to the game's plot, the heir to the empire, before turning into a ruthless boss, first had to approach the character 5 times and try to intimidate him with his insults. And if the player ignored the impudent blonde, it only made the enemy stronger, and ultimately led to negative outcome. Weir 77 called indifference. Aslania thought that it would be easier to deal with him if he got closer. Besides, she shouldn't raise her popularity level above 80. Otherwise, it might also summon the boss. But the problems didn't end there, because if Rudin didn't become the boss, he would take the emperor's throne, and getting such a leader for your country would be a bad continuation of the plot. The girl finally made a decision and looked at the boy who was still smiling stupidly and shifting from foot to foot. She said that in the letter, the king reported his son's desire to settle the conflict. The duke's daughter announced that she was no longer angry with the crown prince and considered the incident closed and also offered to shake hands. Ruden extended his hand to her, but it was clear that the teenager was experiencing fear and horror at the thought of their fingers and palms touching. The heiress of Livenshurt began to actively shake the boy's hand and think about how she would try to make a normal person out of him. Suddenly, the crown prince finally found the strength to say something and immediately proposed to her, offering to marry him immediately. In response, the heir to the empire immediately received a hefty slap on the back of the head, to which Aslania now had the official right granted by the king. After some time, the boy left their domain, and the sorceress was finally able to relax. She hoped that the country's ruler's request only concerned the school and did not extend to her personal life. Before falling asleep, the girl thought that she would finally go to school, where there would be many new, interesting meetings, acquaintances, and adventures. The main events of the storyline are supposed to unfold in the final years of Yggdrasil High School, where the culmination of this whole story will take place. But first, it is necessary to complete the junior classes, which as a rule are recruited from the age of 11, and in exceptional cases from the age of 10, as in Giovanni. Primary school education lasted only 3 years, but it was a compulsory stage of development. Suddenly, Aslania found herself starting her education not at high school, but at a lower level, and this was unusual because she had never encountered primary education in the game. Of course, the immortal soul had been through the fantastic attraction from top to bottom, but she had only heard that the children's building was located somewhere near the Imperial Palace, but she had never been there. The high school was located in the western part of the city and was the largest branch of Yggdrasil. Finally, the senior final stage of training occupied several buildings in the east of the village. There were rumors that the school's location along the perimeter of the city walls was due to the need to quickly respond to monsters entering the outskirts of the city. The reason why monsters entered our world was simple: the opening of gates to another dimension. No one knew exactly what caused this anomaly, but they assumed that magical distortions were to blame. Also, somewhere nearby, there was a creepy place that had several names, but most often it was used to increase the number of points. There you could really improve your level, although you had to work hard. Aslania was definitely planning to get there someday. However, that was still a long way off, and now the young sorceress wanted to immerse herself in the fun and exciting school life. Now her main task was to make a reputation for herself as an exemplary student, to delve into her knowledge, and to behave as befits a good girl without mistakes and hasty decisions. The second point is to keep an eye on Juven and Ruden, so that these little boys grow up into adequate and decent men, and not into dangerous and bloodthirsty monsters. And the final goal is to get what the rebellious soul was deprived of in its previous life: a large number of diverse friends and acquaintances. Aslania knelt down still on the bed and spread her arms out to the sides, as if she were getting ready to hug all of her future friends at once. After some time, the Duke's daughter was already in her school uniform and at classes, and everything seemed to be going well for her, but something was bothering her. For some reason, the other students were doing everything they could to stay as far away from young Lady Livenshurt as possible, and that was strange. When Aslania first entered first grade, everything seemed clear and simple to her. However, the atmosphere at school itself was completely different from when she played Fantastic Attraction. The students looked sideways at the girl whispered, and were simply afraid to approach her. It was noticeable how they tried to keep their distance. The young schoolgirl didn't understand what was going on, but she felt as if she was being enveloped by some kind of dark magic that didn't let anyone get close. Aslania had expected to have a fun school life surrounded by new friends, but instead, she spent her time in a strange sense of loneliness and alienation. Trying to calm herself down and explain what was happening, the Duke's heiress suggested that her high social position was to blame, since in her class there were only 2 at her level. The rest were below. In addition, most of her peers were a full year older than the girl, so the combination of these factors could well have created some tension that deprived her of close contacts. But even with those who were equal to her in status and age, she was unable to establish any kind of relationship, which alarmed Aslania and prevented her from concentrating on her studies. However, the Duke's daughter hoped that these were temporary and solvable things. The main thing was that gossip about her past adventures did not reach the walls of the educational institution. But one day, the young sorceress accidentally overheard a conversation between a boy and a girl from school. They were saying that striking the emperor's son was treason, and it was unclear why she had managed to escape punishment. Now, the situation seemed quite understandable. The children avoided Aslania because they considered her dangerous and unpredictable. But she didn't blame them for this, but was glad that she had so easily avoided the consequences. The duke's daughter just didn't know what to do with such a reputation. After all, how can you build a relationship with a person you fear? However, the sorceress hoped that children were first and foremost curious and inexperienced creatures who would sooner or later begin to communicate with her, and then she would not miss her chance. And then one day, a group of 2 boys and a girl approached Aslania. They politely greeted her and asked if they could sit next to her. Their faces seemed familiar to the sorceress, and she made some effort to remember where and when she could have seen these guys. Of course, the Duke's heiress recognized them, because they were the Steel Empress's confidants, cruel and cold-blooded accomplices of the evil boss who loved to bask in the rays of someone else's glory. The young lady thought that she would also rewrite this part of the story, and politely declined the introduction, replying that she wanted to sit alone. The girl with pink hair was surprised, and asked again if she really liked sitting alone, because it must be terrible. Then the green-haired boy smiled affably and introduced himself. It was Harmon, the son of Count Ist. He added that nobles from the upper classes should stick together. Aslania remembered that in this world the division existed not only between commoners and aristocrats, but also between the levels of noble families, where birth largely determined your life. Suddenly, a group of boys approached from the doorway, all vying with each other to sit next to Lady Levenshart, to which Harmon replied that they were late and the place was taken. Then, literally, every child in the class went crazy and rushed towards the Duke's daughter to take the desk next to her. They just climbed and climbed, shouting over each other and trying to get to know each other. Girls and boys vied with each other to offer friendship, invite her to visit, give her names and statuses, so that Aslania instantly found herself in the center of everyone's attention. For the first couple of minutes, the sorceress tried to remember who was who so as not to make a mistake in her choice, but the flow of information overwhelmed her, blocked her thoughts, and paralyzed her memory. Suddenly, the Duke's heiress heard a familiar voice. She would always remember it because so many unpleasant memories were associated with it. It was the same pink-haired girl who was now trying to be her friend. And according to the game's plot, she immediately betrayed the Steel Empress as soon as she turned away from the path of evil. Meanwhile, the argument in the class was getting serious. Everyone wanted to sit next to or as close as possible to the star that had appeared, and the sorceress tried to calm their ardor. However, her voice was instantly drowned out by this noisy din of various shouts and cries. Unable to bear it any longer, Aslania added some magic to her hand, then slammed the table and told the children to stop arguing immediately because she wanted to sit alone. The result was simply stunning. Everyone present froze in horror, looking at the fragile first grader and what remained of the sturdy oak tabletop on the desk. And while the smoke from the broken tree still hung in the air, the Duke's daughter added that if she said something, then it should be listened to the first time and not wait for the use of force. The school children began to timidly ask for forgiveness, but at that moment, their teacher entered the classroom. From the doorway, the woman was surprised at how quiet it had become before her arrival. And while the teacher was telling how she hoped that the students would behave decently and with dignity, Aslania began to cry bitter tears because she had lost her temper and used magic. As for Rudin, his affairs were as follows. During the break, he raised his hand to heaven and began to communicate with God. The Crown Prince placed his left hand on his chest and extended his right hand to the Almighty, asking why he was so cruel, and did not help the protagonist unite with the love of his life. But this wasn't enough for the boy, and he climbed onto his desk so that everyone could see how he was suffering, although his classmates perceived this eccentricity as unworthy behavior for the son of a king. Meanwhile, Juven was also emotionally unstable, and in an extremely depressed state, with tears even streaming down his face. His sadness was also connected with Nuna, because he had hoped to be in the same class with his friend. But in the end, they were separated, and now the boy felt lonely and abandoned. At the same time, the children in the class of the heir of Appleton were very scared because the boy literally exuded dark tentacles of arcane magic, since he did not yet know how to keep his power under control. The Marquise's son thought that his beloved was now in a different class, surrounded by unfamiliar peers, whom she had probably already met, and all these thoughts instantly lowered his mood. The teenager's emotional background automatically created a negative aura that had a very negative effect on those around him, and those sitting very close fainted. As a result, the first day of school became a difficult test for all three heroes. For Aslania, it ended with a broken desk and a reputation as an unsociable and dangerous girl. For Rudin, it was a loss of respect because he behaved like a crazy lover who didn't care about those around him. Juven distinguished himself by his ability to fall into prolonged depression out of the blue and by his complete lack of control over his abilities. After a couple of days, the situation did not improve at all, as Aslania witnessed other children making acquaintances, starting friendships and communication. And only during this time, no one approached the young lady Levenshurt, even for small things like asking for an eraser or a spare pen. The torture of loneliness proved unbearable, and the sorceress decided to act because she had to get out of this viscous swamp of alienation. Aslania quietly called out to two girls who were just talking about stationery and asked them to lend her an eraser. In response, both schoolgirls immediately fell to their knees and, respectfully lowering their heads, held out the requested item. The sorceress was shocked by such a reaction. Then the young sorceress realized that her actions had terribly frightened the children. However, she was still the center of attention, and this flattered her. However, very soon, an area a couple of meters wide formed around the girl, which was even called the Aslania Exclusion Zone, where everyone was afraid to enter. For a while, the young sorceress could bear loneliness, but she went to school to find friends, and not just to sit at a desk. However, whenever the teenage girl tried to establish contact with her peers, she did it very poorly. The children were once again frightened by these manifestations of character from an incredibly strong and not always adequate classmate. At some point, the young lady's patience ran out, and she simply ran out of her own classroom into the street to clear her head and think about the situation. While walking through the schoolyard, Aslania suddenly saw a small kitten sitting alone behind a low green flower bed. The Duke's heiress squatted down and extended her hand to the furry animal, offering him friendship. The elementary school student continued to call the cat and hoped that he would respond and come closer to her, but the little ball of fur continued to watch the stranger from his hiding place and did not move. Aslania came closer and suddenly saw that it was not an animal at all, but just a strangely crumpled paper bag. And then she felt uneasy because if someone saw it, they would think that she was crazy. But the next moment, the student heard a stifled laugh behind her, which meant that someone was watching her latest failure and saw everything. The unknown schoolgirl turned out to be a girl with pink hair who politely called the Duke's heiress by name. This silent scene lasted for some time, during which Aslania was ready to sink into the ground from shame. For some reason, all her attempts to make friends ended in epic failure. Meanwhile, the unfamiliar schoolgirl continued to giggle subtly. In her hands was exactly the same paper bag that was now lying behind the flower bed. The Duke's daughter had a glimmer of hope that the pink-haired girl had arrived recently and had not seen anything, so she asked her how long she had been standing there. However, the stranger continued to remain silent and smile mysteriously, clutching a similar bundle in front of her. In obvious confusion, Aslania thought that school life in this world was not at all like the episodes from the game Fantastic Attraction. Many things were different. Suddenly, a schoolgirl with a bag asked if Lady Levenshurt had any friends, and the sorceress thought that most likely the girl had seen everything from beginning to end, and therefore she began to cry. But then the stranger admitted that she came there because the garbage really did look like a kitten from afar, and she also wanted to feed it. But now she sees that this is impossible. In this way, the girl diffused the situation and allowed Aslania to breathe out and start smiling. The owner of the pink hair continued to squint cheerfully and look at the Duke's daughter with a welcoming gaze. And after a short pause, the girls laughed merrily and began to rejoice at such an unusual episode in the schoolyard. Finally, the sorceress calmed down and, wiping tears from her eyes, asked what the name of her new acquaintance was. The student with the bag, still smiling, replied that her name was Riley Hemington. The sorceress complimented her on her beautiful name, and then, looking at the lamppost against the sky, said that she probably wouldn't introduce herself since everyone probably already knew her. Riley replied that it was true there were few duchesses in Yggdrasil, especially those who destroyed the school furniture with a blow of their hand on the first day of school. And the girls laughed again, Aslania still felt a little awkward about the situation, but she realized that now she finally had a real chance to make a friend. The younger girl sat down on a nearby bench and began discussing animals, starting with cats. And it turned out that they both had a warm attitude towards them. And then Hemington invited her new friend to come visit her and introduce her to her pets. It turns out she has 3 cats living at home. The young sorceress was a little surprised by such a quick invitation to visit from a stranger, and thought for a moment. However, she immediately came to the conclusion that if fate gives you a chance, you must take advantage of it immediately. When Aslania returned to class, she already had a new friend named Riley. The other children were very surprised by this circumstance because they thought that the Duke's heiress was too dangerous for any contact. However, Hamilton looked not only unharmed, but even happy when talking to the Duke's heiress. The girls discussed various pets and animals and were genuinely happy about this chance meeting. Aslania had no idea how much she missed her friend, so despite the limitations of her status and position, she even went to hug Riley in front of everyone. The classmates who witnessed this scene were shocked and even initially assumed that the Duke's daughter had forced Riley to be friends, but soon they became convinced of the sincerity of these impulses. The young sorceress was truly happier than ever. In her past life, she could only dream of friendship, but now she had every chance to enjoy it. Since then, the attitude towards Aslania began to change. It all started with rumors between the children that she was a normal girl, and what happened on the first day was a misunderstanding. And the more closely the friends communicated, the better those around them spoke of young Livenshirt. Having consolidated her success, the young sorceress began to think about increasing the number of her friends, because 1 friend is certainly good, but 2 are better. Aslania shielded her eyes with her hand and began looking around in search of suitable candidates. At one of the desks sat Shaden von Heinberg-Ruden's brother, whom the Duke's daughter had already seen at that ill-fated birthday reception. He was an intelligent child who from an early age read mountains of all kinds of literature and studied with the best martial artists, and his name meant cold beauty. Lady Livenshirt thought that befriending Shaden was right and useful in every sense. Because of all the high-level game characters, he was the most adequate. Suddenly, Aslania's train of thought was interrupted by Ruden, who burst into the classroom and ran up to the girl. He assumed a theatrical pose and prepared to pour out his experiences on the schoolgirl. The 2 brothers had a strong rivalry from a very young age because they were very different and perceived the world in their own way. The cheerful one was an egoist, and the calm one was a patriot. The Duke's heiress recalled that their feud would only grow stronger with each passing year, and eventually only one would be able to remain in the country. A plan arose in the young schoolgirl's head, according to which she would try to make friends with Shaden and bring Ruden to his senses, so that in the end their kingdom would not suffer from disputes among the elites. Meanwhile, Aslania looked out the window and saw that the school day was drawing to an end, and Juven still hadn't visited her, which was unlike him. Just recently, a boy asked Nuna if she had managed to make friends in the new place. Then the sorceress replied that someone like her would always find friends wherever she went, and now Aslania thought that it had been a mistake to say such a thing to the shy teenager. The Marcus's son, of course, congratulated his friend on the news, but it was clear that he was not very happy about it. Juven turned around and left, and from that day on, he never came to visit her again, as he had done before. The schoolgirl sat at her desk and thought hard, because she had to manage many processes that without proper attention could become the source of major problems. After some time, they finally managed to meet in the class of the Appleton heir, and the boy looked cheerful and said that each of them should have friends. As she walked out the door, Aslania caught herself thinking that she was very surprised by such a change in her adopted brother's behavior. Then the Duke's daughter decided to secretly follow Juven and did not go to her room, but went to the window in the classroom and began to watch. With horror, the young sorceress saw that around the Marquis's son there was the same exclusion zone as there was around her, only much wider. The sorceress covered her mouth with her fingers and decided that she absolutely had to have a heart-to-heart talk with Juven so that he could speak out and she could share her recipe for friendship. But the problem turned out to be much more serious than Aslania could have imagined. Dark changes had already begun to occur in her adopted brother's class. The teacher tried to influence the children and stir them up so that they would stop being so serious and cold, asking the students to at least smile. However, the aura that Juven exuded was stronger than any words or persuasion. It literally subjugated the entire class. The Marquise's son was extremely distressed by the fact that his girlfriend had made numerous friends' acquaintances. He understood that this was normal, but he felt worse and worse. The Appleton heir stopped thinking about his studies altogether. The only painful thought that was playing in his head was that Nuna's new friends would push him out of her life. And these childhood fears very quickly developed into real paranoia, which became more and more difficult to get rid of with each passing day. At some point, the little wizard suddenly came to the conclusion that each of Aslania's new friends was his personal enemy who wanted to take his love away from him. Yuvin thought that the increase in the number of friends would lead to Nuna giving herself to them all the time, and he would have nothing left and would simply disappear from her life. This thought was unbearable. But the worst thing, thought the Marquise's son, was that one of his friends could become something more and turn into her boyfriend, with whom his beloved would walk holding his hand. And at some point, they will start hugging, and sincere feelings will flare up between them. Then everything will be lost. After all, they will definitely kiss and become close like real lovers. Suddenly, Yuvin's fist clenched with emotion, and the beautiful feather broke into two pieces. The Appleton heir was completely plunged into darkness, and concluded that if he could not know in advance who would take Nunu from him tomorrow, then any student was a potential enemy. In the school classroom, under a beautiful chandelier, an unpleasant but extremely important conversation took place. Aslania was shocked by the news that Juven had suddenly disappeared, and no one could find him. When the Yggdrasil staff searched all possible places where he could have disappeared, they sent one of the teachers to the Duke's daughter, since she was his only friend. Having realized the problem, the girl independently set out to search, starting in the dark places of the school itself, where older students sometimes bullied younger students. However, instead of Juven, there was some other boy whom Aslania quickly helped and continued the search. Running around the school grounds, Nuna thought not only about where her adopted brother had disappeared to, but also about what had caused his disappearance. And suddenly, the sorceress remembered the ring that the boy had given her for her birthday. It was pulsating with magical energy, clearly trying to tell its owner something. The Duke's daughter did not wear the gift on her finger, but preferred to hide it under her clothes, hanging it around her neck as an amulet or talisman. However, this did not affect its functionality in any way. Moreover, at some point, a dark purple beam emerged from the artifact, turning into a real arrow pointing in a specific direction. Guided by the power of the ring, Aslania set off along the route, indicated by the decoration, and quickly approached the border of the school grounds. Apparently, she needed to leave Yggdrasil. A primary school student stopped near the exit where a security guard was on duty. She couldn't pass by, which meant she had to come up with a way to get around the guard. Suddenly, the arrow jumped up and pointed to the top of the fence, so Nuna began to evaluate a possible escape in that direction, especially since it was not high there. Using the magic of amplification skillfully, the girl reached the top of the stone fence and grabbed hold of its surface with her hand. With a swift movement, Aslania shifted her body weight and literally flew over the barrier, and then quickly headed to where the restless arrow was calling her. Yuven was waiting for her in the middle of a small park, very close to the school. He was very happy about her visit. The young sorceress saw that the boy was not in danger and immediately broke into a smile. Perhaps he was just bored, but was afraid to admit it, she thought. But the eyes of the Marquis's son were somehow strange, and he grinned bloodthirstily and called the girl to go with him to a distant country. And when Juven rose above the ground, spreading his terrifying wings, Aslania realized that she had paid too little attention to her friend, and the messenger of darkness awakened within him. This was no longer the timid boy who was embarrassed to make friends. A very strong and dangerous opponent was hovering in the air before the sorceress. But what was strange was that according to the game mechanics of Fantastic Attraction, the evil boss Yuven would spread his wings before attacking the enemy. According to legend, this monster in the final stages of its development craved only one thing: infinite power, so that no living creature could compare to its might. However, Appleton only took on a winged form when he felt his inevitable defeat and was about to give a final fight, so it turns out that something had already driven the boy emotionally. Aslania understood that her friend was drawing strength from an endless source of dark magic, and did not know how to stop this feeding from the dangerous and cruel elements. Observing the behavior of the boss, who had appeared ahead of time, the young sorceress tensely recalled any details that could help her in this situation. Apparently, Juven was consumed by one of his childhood fears and felt himself on the verge of total defeat, so he adopted a kind of defensive posture that was actually needed for an attack. The teenager hovering in the air insisted that they rise high together and fly away from the kingdom to a place where only the two of them could live. Then the dark messenger took 2 blue cards out of his pocket and said that these were tickets to an uninhabited island called Ohorama Aslania. Only needed to touch the paper, and she would be there. The idea of dropping everything and immediately heading to a deserted and distant corner of land was completely at odds with all the girl's plans for a happy life in this world. The boy dreamily closed his eyes and said that there would be no one there except them, which meant they would have an eternity to enjoy each other's company. Aslania began to understand that Juven's pathological passion for strength and power had already considered the girl his property, and any encroachment on her was not permitted in any form. And while the Marquise's heir described their happy life away from other people, the sorceress considered a plan of further action to neutralize this unexpected enemy. Nuna rolled her eyes dramatically and replied that she liked the picture her brother had drawn, but she didn't want to go anywhere right now. And when Juven asked why, Aslania replied that she wasn't going on any trip with the evil boy, to which the teenager simply responded by rushing forward. Coming close, young Appleton stopped and asked why she was behaving like this. Maybe it was Riley who took his place, or the Duke's daughter found another boy. However, the young sorceress was not going to play by this boss's rules, and replied that she would only agree to fly to the island with someone stronger than her. The Marquise's son seemed puzzled and asked again. It was obvious that the boy had lost the initiative and was now trying to figure out what was going on. And when Aslania confirmed her words that she loves strong guys, Juven laughed and added that his strength knows no bounds. Appleton continued to laugh and remarked that it would be easy for him to defeat Nunu, since she was much weaker than the Marquise's heir. The sorceress was unpleasantly surprised by such insolence and self-confidence of her adopted brother, because the level of his real experience in magical combat was 0. The sorceress glanced around the surrounding area. She was interested in making sure that no one was around in the park. She didn't want anyone to get hurt, and she suggested that they settle their dispute with a duel right there and then. Juven clenched his fist and prepared for the fight. He was confident in his strength, because his mind was clouded by dark magic. Appleton apologized in advance for causing the girl some pain and discomfort, to which Aslania responded with a willingness to be patient. The sorceress took a fighting stance and offered the boy an attack, to which he immediately made his magical move. The young magician pointed his hand towards the schoolgirl and began to cast a spell. At the same time, Juven began to talk about how the mechanics of spells make it much easier and faster to kill people than to capture them or disarm them. Continuing to strike with his dark spells, the young sorcerer added that a slight advantage was needed to kill an opponent, but a much higher level of skill was needed to capture him. That's why Appleton wanted to grab his opponent, to guarantee his superiority, and the next moment transport them to an uninhabited island. At some point, Aslania missed the throw of one of the purple ribbons, and it wrapped tightly around her body, restricting her movements and causing considerable physical pain. The suffering was so severe that beads of sweat appeared on the girl's face, but she clenched her teeth and continued to fight. And suddenly, the sorceress remembered one of the strengthening spells, which repeatedly weakened the enemy's spell and turned a mortal duel into a battle of children. The sorceress grinned and simply pulled the ribbons off herself, as if they had no magical nature, but covered an ordinary box with a gift. Having thrown off the remaining bonds, Aslania asked her opponent if he had any more powerful spells in reserve. The boy was shocked to the depths of his soul. He had relied on these complex and cunning spells, which had now dissipated like smoke in the wind. Juven then yelled at his friend, asking why she didn't want him to hug her with his arms, to which the girl remarked that it didn't look like a hug from a loving person. The sorcerer flatly refused to call his magical limbs tentacles, as the sorceress demanded, and added that he was trying to express his feelings in this way. Suddenly, the Marquis's heir fell silent and strained to cast a new spell. Following this, a huge magical axe appeared above Aslania and flew straight at her head. Juven accompanied the attack with a comment that he was doing all this out of an excess of feelings for her. The blow was so powerful that for a moment, even the sorcerer himself froze in indecision from the bright flash of light that appeared at the point of collision between the weapon and the Duke's fragile heiress. Nuna's hand grabbed the butt of the axe, frozen right next to her face and neck. Then she smiled and prepared to respond to the attacker with another round of compliments. Aslanya was sincerely grateful to the lessons of her mentor Schumann, who taught her well and trained her for such occasions. The schoolgirl squeezed the magic axe in her hand until it crunched, and it began to disintegrate in the air, and then added that if Yuvin didn't show at least something serious, then she would go home because it was getting boring here. The messenger of darkness had a pretty good imagination, as the monsters he summoned attacked in very specific ways, including crawling, jumping, and even flying ones. Arrows, spears, tentacles, and other magical instruments sought to cause Aslania at least some damage, but she steadfastly and easily repelled all attacks. With something unimaginable was happening to young Appleton, he accompanied each new attack with words and phrases about love, and then threw another charge towards the sorceress. The sorceress dodged another spell with a smile, and said that she felt awkward, because he was either calling Nunu his sister or declaring his love, so the sorcerer had to make up his mind. But the most surprising thing was how much mana the boy spent, and where he got such gigantic reserves of dark energy needed for all these magical techniques. At some point, instead of another weak spell, the sorcerer summoned an unusual red sphere with a pattern resembling an eye. Aslania had never encountered anything like this before, and thought that the boy probably had not created her, but that she had separated from his body, which she had partially controlled until then. This enemy seemed more serious to the sorceress, so she prepared for a real battle, hoping that by destroying this sphere, she would free Yuvin from the evil influence. The sphere hung for a while above the boy's head, and then began to slowly approach the sorceress. The Duke's daughter raised her hand towards the red glow, intending to destroy this creature of evil. The sphere was literally ablaze with fire, and it was very painful to put your fingers near it. Aslania instinctively pulled her hand away from the source of heat, but firmly decided to deal with this unusual thing at all costs. Gathering all her strength and putting maximum effort into strengthening magic, the girl grabbed the strange ball from both sides and squeezed it as tightly as she could. She screamed at the sphere that she intended to change her fate and the lifelines of other heroes so that they would not be evil bosses, but would become good people. Increasing the pressure on the magical surface with each passing second, Aslania said that there is only one person in the world who can change her life. It is herself. When the ball burst under the strain and shattered into 1,000 pieces, a blinding flash of white light illuminated the world around it. It was sunny in the park, the darkness had dissipated, giving way to natural daylight. The sorceress ran up to Yuvin and helped him not to fall. He looked very tired and was literally falling off his feet. Nuna then thought that this battle had definitely increased her experience in magical duels, so now she had become much stronger and more confident. Young Appleton slowly regained consciousness, and Aslania laid him down on the green soft grass so that he could recover from the fight and recover a little, although she herself also needed recharging. The Duke's daughter was sincerely glad that everything ended so well, and she also thought that she should thoroughly scold the stupid boy, but she would do it later. Now was not the time. The Marquise's son was still unconscious, turning his head from side to side and muttering incomprehensible words. After some time, the Duke's heir was brought to his native estate. For bad behavior, the school administration decided to punish the student by suspending him from classes for a whole month. So now Juvin was sitting on his bed and crying bitterly. Shame and disgrace overwhelmed the teenager, and he could not recover from the feeling of his own failure. But most of all, the boy suffered not because of the troubles in Yggdrasil, but because he showed himself in a bad light in front of his beloved Nuna. He did not know how to look his friend in the eyes now. At the same time, the boy analyzed his condition and came to the conclusion that after that battle changes had occurred inside him, he felt lighter in his soul, and it was as if an unknown stone had fallen from his shoulders. Juvin remembered wanting to leave the kingdom to abandon his family and friends, but now it seemed like a bad dream or an unhealthy delirium. Burning with shame, the boy even began to think that it would be better if he died as a result of that fight, because now it would be more difficult to look Noon in the eyes than to die. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Aslania appeared on the threshold. She inquired about the well-being of the Marquis's son, to which young Appleton did not know what to answer. The Duke's daughter did not look upset or angry. On the contrary, she was smiling and seemed to be in a great mood. Juvin thought that now he would be scolded, perhaps even beaten, and he understood that there was no justification for his actions, and prepared himself to accept the inevitable retribution for what he had done. Nuna came closer, put her hands behind her back, and said that the boy looked fine on the outside, but she was more concerned about his internal state. The boy was a little surprised. He expected that now he would be showered with curses and accusations of crimes committed, but everything was different. Aslanaya laughed and asked why her little brother thought she would scold him so much. Juven turned his gaze to the painting hanging on the wall and replied that what he had done was very bad, and he must be punished for it. However, the sorceress replied that the young sorcerer acted on the instructions of an evil magical entity that controlled his behavior and intentions, so it was impossible to place all the blame solely on him. When the boy heard that Nuna's most important thing was his physical and mental health, he was very happy and decided to share his new feeling of lightness and peace within. Juven put his hand to his chest and told Aslanija about the changes in his condition because he had never experienced anything like this before. Then the Marquise's son fell silent and began to cry quietly, wiping away his tears with his hand, which greatly worried the sorceress because she thought that now everything was over and she could breathe a sigh of relief. The Appleton estate echoed with heart-rending wails and pitiful cries as the sobbing child finally realized that his beloved held no ill will towards him. It took Aslanija some time to figure out what had happened. She stood there hesitantly, going over possible versions of childhood psychological trauma. After crying his eyes out, the boy confessed that the meaning of his life would now be to make his older sister's life better, and he promised to think about the consequences before every action. After making sure that Juven really felt better and that the child had found his feet in his soul, Nuna hugged the teenager tightly and said that he was now ready for punishment. The Marquise's son didn't know how to react properly in such a situation, so he simply trusted his older sister, who laid him across her knees and began spanking him on the butt. Little Appleton tried to stop his friend, but she no longer listened to him. Meanwhile, while on school grounds, Rudin sneezed very loudly and frequently. Other school children approached him and asked how he was feeling, to which the heir to the empire, wiping his nose, answered the same thing, that he was fine. The king's son did not really show any particular symptoms of any illness, but noted that he was constantly experiencing severe cold, although the weather outside was quite warm. Those around him became increasingly interested in his condition, looking at the crown prince with concern. The boy once again thanked the children for their concern and said goodbye to them. It turns out he came to class today only to see Aslanija, but they told him that she was not there. Rudin also learned that Juven had been temporarily banned from visiting Yggdrasil and suggested that Lady Livenshurt might well have gone to see Appleton's son, as they had shown mutual affection. The heir to the empire immediately imagined a picture of their possible date, where the punished schoolboy tries to seduce the young sorceress and thus take her away from the king's son. The worried boy immediately tried to erase this image from his head and thought about what he should do next. And while Rudin was pondering the situation, a man in a brown coat approached him from behind and caught his attention. The stranger politely called the boy by name and then asked him to give him a little time, to which the crown prince agreed. The king's heir did not like being distracted from his important thoughts, but the man was unfamiliar to him, and his good-natured appearance aroused some interest and curiosity. Smiling, the man replied that it was inappropriate to discuss such an important topic in the hallway, and therefore he invited Rudin into the director's office. Once alone, the man looked intently at the king's son, and the smile gradually slid off his face. Then he began to speak. Listening to the new information, the crown prince was truly shocked by the information that was delivered to him. However, when the information was fully announced, a smile shone on the face of the emperor's son, because now his plan for insidious revenge had become quite real and feasible. At the Levenshurt mansion, preparations for the duke's daughter's upcoming exams were in full swing. All this time, Aslanija worked diligently and surrounded herself with a real mountain of all kinds of textbooks and additional literature. And all this in order to achieve her goal and become the best student of Yggdrasil. The sorceress remembered that, according to the plot, her image of the Steel Empress was distinguished by the highest strength and aggression. But in terms of intelligence, she was noticeably lagging behind, so she studied. Rudin and Juven came first. They both brilliantly coped with difficult tasks and had real talents in different areas. Aslanija was determined that she was not only going to catch up with the Fantastic Attractions leaders in academic performance, but to surpass them, meaning she was ready to study hard. And when the results of the preliminary exams appeared on the results board, the picture was as follows. Rudin, Scheiden, and Juven took the first 3 places, and the heiress of Livenshurt only 22nd. This was a real blow for the young student, and at first the girl was even sure that some stupid mistake had occurred, because she had tried so hard and worked so hard. The heir to the empire walked around most contentedly because he had taken the honorable first place and strengthened his vanity and narcissism, so that he walked not only with his head held high, but also with his nose in the air. Rudin constantly teased Aslania with these results, saying that such a low result was shameful even for a supporting character, and yet she was a heroine of the first magnitude. Shaden, who took second place, rejoiced quietly and calmly, and did not forget to congratulate his brother on his leading position in this training stage. Aslania was very surprised to notice that the relationship between the king's heirs had noticeably improved. They now communicated like true friends, and there was no trace of the former enmity. Juven now came to Nuna during every break, and the girl was surprised how he had managed to prepare so well that he took third place even though he hadn't even been to class due to a temporary suspension. To which the Marquise's son modestly replied that he had no particular merit in this, since the tasks in the exam paper were very simple. The sorceress felt a little offended, because apparently these children were real geniuses and prodigies, since they solved complex problems quickly without putting in any effort, unlike her. One day, when the main characters were together, someone suddenly called them by name. It was the same man who had previously invited Rudin for a private conversation. This time, the director called the boys into his office all at once. Finding himself in a stylish and cozy room, the leader of Yggdrasil sat down at his desk and looked at the children. The headmaster began the conversation by saying that the invited students were united by their membership in the Sky Group, which included only those who had already awakened magical abilities. Aslania knew well about this student association, but she didn't think that they would be called up so soon, practically at the beginning of the first year. Moreover, the director mentioned that he had already had a conversation with Rudin about this topic. The firmament had its own organization, and everyone who entered it became in fact the local elite of Yggdrasil, receiving additional rights and high status among the other students. The association was somewhat similar to a community of magicians, and many teenagers could only dream of joining it. In addition to universal admiration and respect, the group's members were given access to special rooms that only members of the firmament could enter. Naturally, a large number of bonuses and perks didn't just appear out of nowhere. Aslania knew a little about this, so she got straight to the point and asked what assignment the director had for them. The man smiled, pleased that the children, despite their age, were already mentally prepared for new challenges, and reminded them that representatives of the Deacon Empire would soon arrive to see them. From the very beginning of the school year, many people on the school grounds were discussing this event, as such events only took place once every couple of years. The Duke's daughter was aware of political life, and knew that there were only two empires in the world, Isaac and Decan, which took turns visiting each other once a year. Relations between the two countries are far from friendly, but for now, they have managed to maintain a stable neutral position thanks to these annual visits. Last year, a delegation from Isaac traveled to Dekang, and this time a return visit is expected. The Dekang people want not only to visit the capital and talk with the emperor, but also to visit Yggdrasil. This means that the visit will be of an expanded nature, with the guests wanting to focus not on middle or high school, but specifically on the elementary grades. Aslania listened to the director in silence and continued to be surprised by the news, because it was all very strange and unusual. Heiress Livenshirt recalled one of the game's endings, in which all the troubles began on the very day the delegation from Decan arrived in Yggdrasil and the irreparable happened. The sorceress tensely went through the images of past years in her head and recalled the details of the incident. Then everything revolved around the senior representative of another country and a student from their school. Now Aslania remembered that the victim was Count Bolton, who had come from Decan with a friendly delegation. The events began on the top floor of the educational institution, where the library was located, and the student who started the conflict was Rudin the Emperor's son, who took the important visit of his neighbors lightly. At some point, the boy attacked the Count and caused him serious wounds and injuries. The newspaper headlines of the time were full of bright and catchy phrases describing the incident. The conflict could not be resolved peacefully, and the flames of hostility flared out of control, causing a full-blown war that ultimately led to one of the negative endings. Aslania thought about it. She had read a description of this event in the library on the game's fan forum, but she hadn't taken part in it herself. The immortal soul in its past incarnation tried to understand this unusual game episode, but the messages on the forum were scattered and inaccurate. Some called the events a staged provocation. Others blamed the crown prince exclusively. In any case, she was now Lady Livensert and had to prevent a bad ending. While examining the pieces on the chessboard, the sorceress asked Rudin what he thought of the neighboring kingdom and its policies. The emperor's son answered without hesitation that in his opinion, the Deccan were their long-standing enemies, and victory over them would be a wonderful achievement on the path to his dominance and greatness. Aslania was completely stunned by such a categorical answer, and decided that the best thing to do in such a situation was to eat as many sweets as possible, because she would definitely need mana. The sorceress lay on her bed, pondering intensely over what she should do, because at the will of the crazy boy, the country could plunge into chaos and burn in the fire of war. The Duke's daughter also wondered whether it would be possible to avoid some key plot points that would determine the course of further events. As she fell asleep, young Livensert came to the conclusion that firstly, she should talk to Rudin again about the neighboring kingdom and explain to him the seriousness of the possible consequences. The next day, when a suitable opportunity presented itself, the sorceress directly asked the crown prince if he was planning an attack on the visiting delegation. The king's son laughed in response and added that he was the heir to the throne and therefore must weigh every word and especially every action because the entire country depended on them. Aslania smiled. She was glad that the boy understood something, but she was confused by his ability to masterfully lie, so the girl decided that she would watch him closely during the reception. The girl glanced around the peaceful atmosphere of the room and thought that in a world where she had a second chance, she would make every effort to avoid war. The Duke's daughter also remembered that the school director had mentioned one of the purposes of Earl Bolton's visit, a meeting with the heir to the empire, Sir Rudin von Heinbusch. To understand the situation, Aslania began studying the local press in order to glean additional important information about the relations between the neighboring states. The headlines of the Isaac Empire newspapers were full of praise for the crown prince as an outstanding genius who was about to become the hero of the continent. But in the kingdom of Dekang, they had a different opinion, where the main star of printed matter was Count Hiram Bolton, while Rudin were relegated to a middle-class league. Moreover, the neighboring kingdom's publications not only praised Hiram's intellect and fighting abilities, but also slandered the entire Isaac Empire. Looking at the photo of a potential enemy, Aslania recalled that there was such a story character occupying the niche of secondary heroes, and he appeared in one of the updates. Bolton's biography emerged. When he was only 13 years old, he had already received a higher education, but now the guy is about 18, and he is not only a master of sword and magic, but also the head of the families. There were no facts in the press that could discredit his brilliant track record. There was only a mention that Hiram possessed a special chloride magic. Sir Bolton didn't become what he is overnight. He had a long and difficult road to the top. When the young nobleman was only 13 years old, his parents suddenly fell ill with a strange mental disorder. The teenager had just completed his studies, but when he returned home, hard and stressful work awaited him. The fact is that the parents' illness progressed, and they were forced to retire. The young heir had to take on the management of an entire family, which was difficult. And at first, the heads of families from neighboring lands did not believe in the teenager's success. They laughed, joked, and looked down on him. Bolton's keen mind and diplomatic talent allowed him to make profitable deals and develop existing assets. By the age of 15, Hiram had fully restored the family's authority and power, and a year later, he took an active part in repelling monster attacks, earning him the love and popularity of the people. As a result, the growing authority of the young count made the teenager almost a national hero of the entire kingdom of Dekang. Having read the biography of the future visitor, Aslania caught herself thinking that she liked him more than Rudin. The sorceress's thoughts revolved around two main options: either change the king's son's attitude towards his neighbors, or simply prevent their meeting. The young sorceress felt a little sorry for the boy that he was being manipulated so easily, but she understood that she was doing this for the common good, in fact, for the sake of the entire country. During another game of chess, the Duke's heiress told the king's son that they needed to have a serious talk. Aslania felt a little awkward, because controlling people like pieces on a board is easy only with words. Then the schoolgirl made a move, saying that the conversation might seem unpleasant to him, but it would be very useful. It was obvious that Rudin was not enjoying this dialogue as he sat in a defensive position, crossing his arms over his chest and crossing his legs. The young schemer said that she shared his position regarding their neighbors from Dekong, and also considered them enemies of Isaac, but she really wanted to avoid conflict between the countries. And therefore, Aslania wants to make sure once again that the king's son really has no plans for aggression towards them. At these words, the boy frowned. Rudin's countermove. She saw him hesitate, and the prolonged silence itself spoke volumes. Time dragged on very slowly, and the silence that reigned in the room for elite students from the firmament began to drive one crazy. Finally, the sorceress could not stand it any longer and repeated her question because her patience had come to an end. In addition, Aslania added that she wanted to know how the heir to the empire would behave if one of the delegates began to behave inappropriately, and Rudin replied that he would act as a hero's duty dictated. The schoolgirl was delighted to hear such an answer. She decided that she had practically received the evidence she needed and asked a new question. How does the king's son see his duty? However, the crown prince, upon hearing these words, turned pale and was horrified, and then in turn asked how she could ask such a thing. The duke's daughter did not understand what was happening and tried to avoid answering, which angered the teenager even more. It turns out that Rudin was sure that Aslania knew exactly what the duty of the protagonist was, since he considered her to be the main character, but upon realizing that the girl was not in the know, he was very upset. In the end, the crown prince clenched his fist and accused Lady Livenshurt of not being a major character, but occupying a secondary position. Then the king's son added that they had nothing more to talk about, turned around and headed towards the exit of the room, leaving the bewildered sorceress alone. From that moment on, Rudin stopped communicating with the duke's daughter and spent almost all his time locked in his chambers, and in the meantime, the day of the Deccan Kingdom's visit to Yggdrasil arrived. Students with a bouquet of white tulips prepared to welcome guests from the neighboring empire. Aslania could not shake the thought of the impending disaster, and the girl was very worried about possible negative situations that could occur on school grounds. Soon the carriage appeared, and those meeting it were ordered to prepare for a ceremonial meeting. Finally, the carriage stopped and the door slowly opened. Everyone froze in anticipation of the guests. Count Hiram Bolton, the national hero of Deccan, and a star of the printed press. The boy smiled good-naturedly, clutching the flowers he had been given, and continued to admire the beauty of the architecture. And suddenly, Aslania saw someone she had hoped not to meet today. It was Rudin. He was standing right behind the visiting stranger. What surprised the duke's daughter most was the fact that the crown prince got out of the carriage after the guest, which meant they had been riding together the whole time. She had thought the boy was sitting in his castle. The top officials chatted pleasantly and exchanged all sorts of compliments and pleasantries, which was extremely unexpected for Lady Levenshurt. The emperor's son was cheerful and pleased. From his behavior, one could tell that the boy was glad to see his dear guest and was greeting him with all possible honors. Aslania turned to Shaden, who was standing next to her, and asked when Rudin had managed to meet the count and why they had arrived in the same carriage. The crown prince's brother replied that it was merely a formality and a confirmation of the rules of etiquette to meet an envoy from another kingdom and accompany him on planned trips. The duke's daughter was very surprised to hear such words. She thought she would have to restrain the little brat, but he suddenly climbed into the fire himself and behaved with dignity. After finishing his visit to Yggdrasil, Earl Bolton lingered a little, saying goodbye to the school students at the carriage. He thanked everyone for the warm welcome and the good time. The director was very pleased that the envoy of the dean praised his school in every possible way and spoke flatteringly about his visit in general. Aslania and Rudin stood nearby quite satisfied and calm that the reception was a success. But suddenly, Hiram turned to the king's son and addressed him with apologies. The boy looked at the guest and was a little surprised because everything had gone well, and he did not understand why he should ask forgiveness. A sly smile crossed the count's face. It was obvious that he had been preparing for these words and had planned it all in advance. Bolton walked up to the prince and leaned right into his ear, then said that the newspapers in Dekong were relentlessly throwing mud at Rudin von Heinberg, and doing so on his personal orders. The crown prince tensed up, and it was clear that the boy was holding back his rage and aggression. But out loud, he only said that he didn't understand what they were talking about since he rarely read newspapers. The guest replied that in that case, this information was of no importance, and the heir to the throne could simply forget about it. Then he extended his hand towards his opponent. Bolton's gesture, and then decided to return the handshake. What was happening was very strange, because in fact, the envoy of Deccan did everything to provoke the crown prince at the very end of his visit. And when their hands touched and clasped, something incredible happened. It was as if lightning had struck Rudin. The boy did not understand what was happening. He was conscious, but the world around him changed dramatically. Its colors instantly faded, and everything was covered in a dark fog. Images of his father mentors and servants flashed past all of them, repeating in one voice that the crown prince was the incarnation of Yongun himself, the legendary hero slayer of demons and gatherer of lands. Everyone was saying that only Rudin could defeat the kingdom of Dekang and unite the two countries into one so that everyone could live in peace and harmony. But to do this, he had to do something. Defeat Bolton. The schoolboy looked at the tall guy, and the thought grew stronger in his head that the meaning of his existence as the main character lay in defeating the enemy neighbor. Meanwhile, Hiram squinted at the king's son and seemed to be waiting for something. And Rudin was ready to act. He had already begun to think through his attack, but suddenly a random thought and a fleeting memory switched his attention to another topic. It was a very recent episode when the crown prince tried to find out from Yuven where he and Aslania had disappeared to that day. The rival never confessed to anything, although as a result of their disappearance, the boy was banned from attending school for a whole month, and the duke's daughter constantly visited him at home. The emperor's son did not believe the official version that the school children had encountered a monster in the garden, but he told Yuwen that he was not interested as he had another more significant goal. And then the marquis's son said that there was no more noble and desirable goal in the world than to make Nuna smile and rejoice with all her heart. From then on, these words often sounded in the prince's head. And then young Appleton added that he had already succeeded in this a couple of times, and he wanted to do it again and again, to which Rudin found nothing to say. The king's son remembered her hair and eyes, but he could not find Aslania's smile in his memory. She usually looked at him sullenly because his actions did not bring joy to her, and the crown prince himself often felt irritated at the sight of her image. But is this what he wanted from their relationship? What should he strive for then if he cannot even evoke a simple female smile? The heir to the throne squeezed Bolton's hand with all his strength and thought that he would definitely punish him, but not now, because at that moment the death of his enemy was more important to him than the joy in the eyes of his beloved. The boy laughed and told the provocateur that he was very glad to meet them and would look forward to their next visit. Those present breathed a sigh of relief, and the delegation of ambassadors set off on their return journey while it was still a clear and sunny day in the courtyard of Yggdrasil. The crown prince stood at the school window and reflected on the past days. He felt somehow sad and melancholy. Aslania saw the boy and noticed that his psychological state was far from normal because, as a rule, he was cheerful and in a good mood. Young Livenshirt called out to the king's son, and he noticed that she was looking at him. The sorceress ran up to the boy and asked why he changed his mind, what happened in his head and consciousness that influenced his choice. The sorceress also asked why Rudin had left his room, where he had been sitting for so long, before the visit, to which the schoolboy replied that he could not miss this visit. Aslania then said that she saw the Earl of Bolton provoke the schoolboy to attack, but added that she would definitely not have been able to contain her anger and would have attacked him. After which, the girl reminded the crown prince of his promise to fulfill his duty as the main hero, and asked what it was if he did not plan to attack the messenger, but the guy did not answer. Seeing that her interlocutor was silent, the duke's daughter raised her voice and asked why he had come and was standing in front of the door of her classroom if he was not going to talk. Finally, the boy could not stand it any longer, and closing his eyes shouted in response that he came to her because he wanted to see her smile. Aslania expected anything from the emperor's obstinate and restless son, who was accustomed to wallowing in luxury and listening to flattering speeches. But this statement came as a complete surprise to her. Rudin continued to pour out his soul and mentioned Yuven, who always made the duke's daughter smile, to which the sorceress noted that she was smiling at both of them. But the crown prince noticed that it was a different smile. The sorceress grimaced and asked if such a smile suited him, to which the crown prince replied that this forced artificial grimace was only capable of humiliating, not encouraging. Aslanaya fell silent. She didn't know what to answer. It was all so unexpected and unusual for her. But one thing was clear. The guy was very worried and very upset. Suddenly, the heiress of Livensert had an idea, and she immediately put it into practice, placed her hand on the prince's fair-haired head, and began to stroke him. Rudin succumbed to her charms and even leaned over slightly. For the first few seconds, he couldn't say anything, but only enjoyed the new feeling that appeared in his chest. Then the boy raised his eyes and began to look at the face of his beloved, expecting to see a miracle. And it happened. Aslanaya smiled that very smile that he had been waiting for, and for which he had overcome himself and gone against anger and irritation. The Duke's heiress also said that Rudin was a good man, and she was proud of him for not falling for the crude provocation and for managing to control himself. The Crown Prince had experienced many emotions throughout his life, but never before had there been such a pleasant and joyful one. This feeling literally overwhelmed the little wizard's soul. Finally, the Emperor's son came to his senses and pushed the girl's hand away. He felt awkward from the genuine happiness he had experienced, but the sorceress noticed that everything was fine. Rudin then decided to leave as quickly as possible to think about what had happened and sort out the thoughts in his head. The heir to the throne was also suddenly struck by the thought that the provocation had been planned and organized, not just like that, but as part of some more complex plan. Meanwhile, someone powerful and influential was reflecting on the failed attempt to pit the Isaac and Deccan empires against each other, and was trying to find the reason for such a failure. It was Hiram staring unblinkingly at the bright flames and thinking that the Crown Prince was not as predictable as he had previously thought. Then he squeezed the red ball hard, and the source of light disappeared. Bolton was disgusted by the thought that the informant who had described the king's son as a stupid and careless egotist had been so cruelly mistaken. The Count sat down on a chair and thought. He was upset that the provocation, which had been in preparation for many months, had fallen apart so easily and ineptly. He was also worried that he would now have to give up his leadership position as Dean's Hawks Group. The fact is that the empires maintained neutrality only for appearance's sake, while in reality they waged an endless hybrid war. But there were also those who wanted a real battle and an official declaration of hostility. And in each country, there was a special organization of hawks that did not want to make peace and negotiate with its neighbors, but dreamed of a large, full-scale war. For several years now, Bolton had been part of a group of aggressive nobles who dreamed of defeating Isaac on the battlefield, and for this purpose, he had developed a cunning and insidious plan, of which Rudin was to become a part. Deep in thought, Hiram tried to understand where he had made a mistake, and why the youth who wanted to attack him had held back, because the boy had been on the very edge but had retreated. Then the former envoy began to analyze other students of the school, whom he considered necessary to remember. For example, young Aslania Livenshirt. She was always somewhere near Rudin. Bolton was aware of her physical transformation and thought it best to inquire about her as soon as possible, as well as to learn in detail about her relationships with the other children. The insidious enemy reflected that such external changes were impossible without serious internal changes, so the girl could very well play her role in some distant game. Perhaps by studying the relationships between the children of the wealthy classes of Yggdrasil, Hiram will be able to weave a new web from which no one will escape. To top it all off, the Count thought that he had only lost this battle, and the war itself between the hawks of the two empires, and each country had its own aggressive group, had only received a reprieve. After the end of the exam session, Aslanaya went to visit her new friend Riley. Her estate was located near the sea, where there was hot sand and turquoise surf. The girls had a great time together, running along the beach, swimming, sunbathing, and enjoying the rays of the warm sun. Aslania also invited Rudin and Juven to this trip, but unfortunately, they both were unable to join their friend and share the joys of a seaside holiday with her. During the holidays, each student was busy with something of his own, and the Marquis's heir was no exception, although his new hobby was far from the classic children's games. Having found the right door with some difficulty in the labyrinth of streets and alleys in a remote part of the city, the teenager froze for a moment in front of the entrance. A garbled sign above the passage stated that this was the headquarters of a guild called Adventurers, but there was another name, Old Tree, which had more widespread publicity. His previous duel with Nuna left a noticeable mark on the boy's soul, and also dispelled his childhood illusions about his own strength. and now the Marquise's son wanted to fill this gap. The little wizard dreamed of becoming an experienced fighter who could not be defeated by the sorceress, who had an advantage of a whole year. The crown prince also did not sit idle. He went into the royal library and studied the relevant literature. At the same time, the boy was interested in only one direction: the works of learned minds on the relationship between the sexes and how to win a partner's favor and win his heart. When the break period ended and a new school term began, the children gathered at the school and watched in amazement at the appearance of the heir to the empire. The boy came to Yggdrasil not alone, but with his new friend, a snow-white horse. But this was not the last new detail in the prince's image. A crooked pattern ran across his eye, vaguely reminiscent of a scar. Only it looked more funny than scary. Aslania did not tolerate such antics, and immediately returned the rider to the ground, taking advantage of the personal permission from her father, the emperor, to physically punish the teenager. The lessons that had begun reminded the sorceress of the days when she had just entered Yggdrasil, and her classmates looked with horror at Lady Livensert, who had the right to raise her hand against Rudin von Heinberg. The sorceress acquired new creepy nicknames such as Hell's Hand, Devil's Grip, or even Instigator of Rebellion, and her former Aslanian exclusion zone also returned to her. However, not all children shared the fears and concerns regarding the Duke's heiress. Some continued to communicate sweetly and carefree with the schoolgirl. For example, Shaden, as soon as the boy entered the classroom, he immediately greeted Aslania. There was not the slightest concern in his behavior or voice. On the contrary, he seemed happy. Usually, the crown prince's brother was quiet and spoke only when spoken to. But this morning, the boy was literally glowing with joy, perhaps because he saw how Rudin got into trouble. According to the plot, Shaden always put the interests of his country first, while his brother put personal gain and vanity first. Young Livenshirt thought that strengthening her relationship with this advantageous and adequate ally would benefit not only her, but the entire kingdom. Quite quickly, the girl was captivated by rosy dreams of future victories and successes on all fronts, and she closed her eyes so that nothing would distract her from her stay in the world of dreams. However, making friends with this young man was not so easy because he preferred to hide his hot heart deep inside under a cold and impenetrable shell of external alienation and indifference. Moreover, the only way to attract his attention and win his favor was to achieve high results on exams, since Shaden preferred to communicate only with intelligent and useful people. The Duke's daughter, however, could not boast of her results, as her level in the final session exams had dropped even lower to 52nd place, while the Crown Prince's brother was among the top 3. However, according to the hero card, in order for this smart boy to notice you, you need to be in the top 50 in grades, so Aslania was not that far from the required minimum. The sorceress approached Shaden and asked if she could sit next to him, to which the boy replied that he didn't mind. Moreover, he had long wanted to talk to her. Aslania really liked his positive and friendly attitude, which meant that grades in this world weren't as critical as they were in the real game. And as soon as the children sat down together, a discussion immediately began between their classmates behind their backs, discussing every breath of the representative of imperial blood. Young Levenshirts still couldn't get used to this attitude from those around her, but she was pleased that the school children spoke about them in a positive light. Being friends with Shaden was not only pleasant, but also useful, since he began to really help the heiress of Levenshert with her lessons, which undoubtedly increased her level of education. When Aslania thanked the young mentor for the teaching, the boy replied that it was not his lessons that were the problem, but that she herself was very smart and a quick learner, and he was merely guiding her mind. Then the Crown Prince's brother uttered a phrase from the game word for word about how it is not enough to have a developed intellect. One must also master special techniques for using it, which made the girl very happy. The Immortal Soul's extensive gaming experience suggested that after such lines, the character's interest in the protagonist increased significantly, meaning it was a definite success. The Duke's daughter was very glad that she had finally managed to get her relationship with the Crown Prince's brother moving forward, because it had been quite difficult. The sorceress then began making plans for Shaden, because such a friend and ally could not only brighten her years, but also provide serious help and support in many areas. Aslania then asked the teenager if he had managed to awaken his magical gift, to which the boy replied that unfortunately, he had absolutely nothing to boast about in this regard, after which the children talked a little about magic and abilities. Young Livenshirt knew from legend that the power would awaken in Shiden by the end of this year, but she could not say this directly. The boy did not yet know that he possessed the magic of bitter cold, the most powerful of the ice spells, and was able to create blocks of pure ice by manipulating them. When the teenage girl first saw his animation while casting a spell, she literally fell in love with this calm angel of pure beauty. And while Aslania dreamily gazed at the pictures of her past life, remembering Shaden in different guises, the lesson came to an end. The teacher gave an assignment and said that the children could go free. Before leaving the classroom, the pair turned to the girl and said that he wanted to ask her something. Then he was silent for a while. It was clear that the question the student wanted to ask was important to him. Shaden looked closely at Aslania and asked what her opinion was about the future of their empire. Isaac? The girl immediately tensed up. She remembered that it was the answer to this question that would determine the entire future fate of their relationship, so it was important to make the right choice. However, the sorceress also knew that the boy should say these words at a more mature age and not in elementary school, because he had not even discovered his magical ability. The Duke's daughter thought for a long time, because she planned to approach this significant plot point only in a few years. And not now, not even after studying in Yggdrasil for a year. Perhaps the sorceress's active behavior affected some of the game's mechanics, and the dialogue chains shifted in time since she had never previously beaten up the Crown Prince in front of the entire school. Young Livenshirt looked into those clear childish eyes that were waiting for her answer and remembered the ending that fantastic attraction had prepared for this hero. Aslania couldn't take her eyes off her new friend and wondered if she could change anything in this world. After all, the sorceress has already intervened in the course of events, shuffled all the cards, and is trying to build this world anew. But will she have enough strength and understanding of the big picture to do so? Finally, the Duke's daughter looked away and began to answer the question. Asked, she decided that she did not know if she could do everything right, but it was her direct responsibility to try. The schoolgirl expressed the idea that peace with the kingdom of Dekang cannot be called strong. It is like a very shaky bridge, which is difficult to move quickly across. Then Shaden asked what to do, and then he began to listen to the addition to the answer, that under the current king of the neighboring state, the situation will not change, but his successor, according to rumors, aims to establish Isaac real world. Then the young patriot remembered the lessons of history. No matter how kind and just the monarch ascending to the throne may be, much depends on his retinue, which is capable of either developing or destroying the ruler's idea. Aslania agreed with her interlocutor's arguments and noted that the emperor's entourage could also influence him in favor of or against something, and therefore played a key role in governing the state. As a result of this political discussion, the young people agreed that the ruler needed a close friend who would tell him the truth and protect him from lies and flattery without fear of risking his life for the country. Then Shaden was silent for a while and began to talk about loyalty, about how it is a very useful quality for the inhabitants of the state. The Crown Prince's brother looked calm and satisfied with the conversation. He smiled and said that now his soul felt calm and lighter than it had in a long time. Then the boy paused for a moment and reached into his jacket pocket, from where he pulled out some object, after which he handed it straight into Aslania's hands. And when the Duke's daughter saw the gift, she was simply shocked by this act. She held a unique item in her palm, which was very difficult to obtain in the game Fantastic Attraction, and only a select few achieved such success. It was a brooch of the imperial family, which the masters of the country gave on exceptional occasions to people who had earned their personal respect and trust. And it also contained powerful magic. Such a gift meant one thing. Shaden's interest had exceeded the level of 50 units, and then love could develop. So Aslania warmly thanked her new friend. And since the lesson was over and the break had begun, the boy hurried out into the corridor, and literally right there, Juven came in. He asked Nunu how she could make friends with such a fool, to which the girl replied that firstly, the Crown Prince's brother was a perfectly worthy conversationalist, and secondly, he was older than the Marquise's son, so he should be addressed more respectfully. And while the second prince had not yet managed to move far from the class, young Appleton managed to wash all his bones and concluded that his personal feeling is that Aslania should stay away from this guy. The next morning, when the Duke's daughter came to class, she saw a letter lying on her desk in her usual place where she sat. Taking the envelope in her hands, the schoolgirl turned it over in her hands a little, then opened it and took out a note. The message did not provide any specific information, but it did contain the time and place where the author proposed a meeting with Aslanya. The lines stated that Lady Levenshurt should come at the end of the day to a hill located northeast of the city, and she should appear right now. The sorceress spent the entire day pondering what awaited her at this meeting. She was sure that the letter had been written by Shaden, and so as soon as the hour struck, she set off to meet adventure. It was indeed the king's son. He smiled when he saw Aslanya, and said that he was glad to see her. The boy thanked the schoolgirl for trusting him, and invited her to look at the stars shining in the dark blue sky. The duke's daughter felt awkward, because she knew these words well. According to the game's plot, they were the beginning of Shaden's declaration of love. But the problem wasn't with the declaration, but with the correct answer. The thing is, according to the legend of the fantastic attraction, saying yes to the guy meant incurring catastrophic negative consequences, and refusing meant his heart would be broken. The teenagers climbed the city wall, and there the boy continued to talk about how he really wanted to bring Aslanya here to show her all the beauty of the night sky. The girl put her hand to her chest, where her heart was beating wildly, because this was an extremely important and exciting moment on which a lot, if not everything, depended. Suddenly, the sorceress was surrounded by a piercing cold, and her fingertips became covered with frost, and large, beautiful snowflakes began to fall from them. Shaden's gaze, he looked at the girl with a chilling gaze, and said that before death, a person should see something beautiful. And then he added that he considered Aslanya a real monster who secretly wormed her way into the trust of others, and he shouldn't talk to her at all, but rather just turn her into a piece of ice. The sorceress tried to find out the reason for such aggression, because she was completely confident that they had a normal relationship that was striving for friendship. The schoolgirl's legs gave way, and she fell to her knees. A pattern of icy snowflakes danced around her. It was the spell of the ice prison. Finally, Shaden answered that this was the answer for the wound inflicted on his brother. Aslanya couldn't believe her ears. She hadn't caused any serious harm to Rudin. The crown prince's brother reminded her of their first meeting when, at the name day, the king's son proposed a closer relationship with the girl and called her his own because he really liked her. The young ice mage said that she could have simply refused, but Levenshurt chose to humiliate him in public, and then after communicating with her, the king's son changed and became a laughingstock. Then Shaden raised his voice and literally shouted that Aslanya had led Rudin astray from his chosen path, and he was no longer the heir to the Isaac Empire that everyone knew. The Lord of Cold was sure that all these negative changes occurred in the boy because of the young sorceress who was to blame for everything and who would freeze to death for it. The treacherous ice mage ended his monologue with the phrase that love is the source of many troubles and destruction, and now he has seen this for himself. Shaden clenched his fist and added that Aslanya poisoned his brother every day, turning the determined heir to the Empire into a stupid fool. These words seemed especially unfair to the girl because Rudin had behaved rather recklessly and ugly even before meeting her. Although, of course, his last stunt as a prince on a white horse was a spectacular failure, and his scar is a general stain of shame for the entire royal family. The schoolgirl remembered how the crown prince pranced on a horse with his face painted, and she began to laugh, even despite the cold. One of the main spells of the ice mage was to immobilize the enemy by freezing them, which hindered almost any movement. It was deserted and quiet all around, and there was no one who could intervene or even distract the guy from his plan. Aslanya had to rely only on herself. Overcoming the pain, the sorceress asked why Shaden disliked his brother so much, to which he replied with surprise that he did not understand where she got that idea from. The duke's daughter gave an example. The brothers never communicate on school grounds, do not walk together, and very rarely talk to each other at all. The boy's answer astonished the sorceress, for it turned out that he had been secretly watching her all this time, assessing whether the heiress of Levenshurt could become a worthy wife to the crown prince. The ice mage added that her magic might be useful to the kingdom, but the harm it inflicted on the heir to the empire was much greater, and he did not want to risk the future of the entire country any further. Aslanya still found it hard to believe that this was actually happening to her, and that this fan favorite was so insidious and was going to freeze her to death. The freezing cold made it difficult to think clearly, but the sorceress still realized that she had an imperial brooch with her, which should help in this situation. The artifact's primary magic was defensive, and it had the power to prevent direct danger directed at the owner. But the gift worked somehow strangely. It radiated power, but the sorceress couldn't activate it at full power. Shaden noticed that Aslania was trying to use the brooch and praised her for her intelligence. The Frost Mage added that he had specifically chosen the item for the sorceress because he wanted to enhance his abilities and guarantee victory in this evening's battle. It turns out that as soon as the boy felt the awakening magic within himself, he immediately began to study the Duke's daughter, collecting materials from her battles and information about her abilities. A freezing Livenshirt listened as her opponent explained how he couldn't win in a fair fight, so he enchanted the family artifact and thanks to it was able to block her powers. The trick was that Aslania could concentrate any amount of magic within herself, but the spell affected her blood and gradually slowed her heart, making her unable to move. And now, Shaden proudly spoke of his trick, demonstrating his superiority in power over the weakening girl. The Duke's daughter could hardly think, realizing how her strength was leaving her with every passing minute. And meanwhile, the evil magician said that the lecture was over, and he was going to freeze and disintegrate her. The cold was unbearable, and Aslania closed her eyes, realizing that she was about to witness an ending that had never happened before, even in her fantasies. The ice wizard glanced at the barely alive schoolgirl and said goodbye to her, intending to finish the job he had started. Suddenly, he froze and said that she should not worry, because his days were also numbered, and soon the Crown Prince's brother would follow the sorceress to the next world, and he would do this for the sake of his kingdom, Isaac. But Aslania no longer listened to the enemy. She concentrated on the remaining bits of consciousness and made desperate attempts to come up with a way out of the current situation. The blood, of course, flowed through the veins very slowly, but it still flowed, so the sorceress tensed up and tried to remove the magic of the brooch from the vessel's arteries and heart. An image of Bertrand teaching his protégé the magic of restoration came into her head. Then Schumann spoke specifically about the situation when the body is exposed to the magic of absolute cold and cannot use ordinary techniques and methods. The only salvation is to concentrate strength and reserves on maintaining the heart's performance. Then, with each beat, the blood will begin to slowly warm up and restore all the body's functions. Aslania, as her mentor had taught her, began to mentally contract the muscles of her heart and those around it in order to stop the piercing cold and save herself. Meanwhile, Shaden came closer and again began to talk about how talented and strong she was, and if it weren't for his intelligence and cunning, he would have no chance in a fair fight. Then the treacherous ice mage put his hand on the girl's shoulder and said that he was of course sorry, but the noblewoman herself was to blame, and her death would serve for the good of the empire. Suddenly, the boy's eyes widened, and they were filled with surprise and the primal terror that people experience in the moment before imminent death. Aslania looked at her opponent and smiled, melting ice running down her face and body, and then asked if the young sorcerer was ready for such a turn of events. And while Shaden looked around fearfully, seeking random support, the sorceress added that Rudin was certainly a fool, but his own brother was no better. The unsuccessful magician began to back away, repeating that this could not be, but the sorceress had already completely thawed and told him to prepare for the upcoming punishment. The next moment, the treacherous enemy realized that he was doomed, because in a one-on-one duel without cunning and deception, he would never be able to stand against Aslania. And then the boy went on a verbal attack, shouting that this was some kind of unreal magic that simply couldn't exist, because he had calculated all the moves and should have won. The sorceress was very pleased to realize that she had coped with this difficult task without outside help, solely through her own understanding of magical processes. Then the sorceress raised her fist and said that she expected much more from the Crown Prince's brother, and was very disappointed with his low and vile act unworthy of a nobleman. After which, Aslania laughed and asked if Shaden knew that she was officially allowed to use physical force against Rudin. The cold prince replied that it did not matter, because she was a bad influence on the one who would eventually take the throne, and that was unacceptable. The sorceress approached the ice mage with lightning speed and said with bitterness in her voice that this was not how she had imagined this evening, as she had been counting on an interesting dialogue. Shaden didn't even try to resist. He just kept saying that the girl should leave the country so as not to have a bad influence on his brother. The sorceress moved so quickly that it was impossible to follow her, so the confused schoolboy soon fell silent. But why was young Livenshirt mistaken in believing that the von Heinberg brothers were bitter enemies? Did her appearance in this world and the reincarnation of an immortal soul really have any effect? The fact is that the princes were born together and lived in friendship at the emperor's court. But on that very day of the name day and reception, when hatred should have been born, Aslania appeared. Ruden's arrogant and self-confident behavior at the event that was to sow deep contempt in Shaden's soul, which over the years turned into hostility. However, the active and aggressive guest completely disrupted the plotline, and further development took a completely different path. The cold prince might not have liked his brother, but they shared the same blood. And when he saw his relative being beaten, his patriotic spirit could not remain unaffected. Shaden watched as the crown prince began to change before his eyes, as he began to come up with all sorts of ideas, and fool around which hadn't happened before. And his public declarations of love for an unknown girl ignited unprecedented jealousy, which ultimately led to real hatred towards the culprit of all these events. Aslania, the duke's daughter, had no intention of remaining silent about this event, so she appealed directly to the emperor himself, since it so happened that both his sons were so closely connected to her. Shaden came to in a familiar environment, but it was strange because just a few moments ago, he was on a night hill outside the city, and now the sun was shining brightly. A familiar and stern voice asked how the boy was feeling, and whether he had come to his senses, to which the boy began to mumble in surprise that he had not expected to see his father. The emperor noticed that this meeting was of an official nature, so he asked to be addressed as Your Majesty. And then the meeting continued. The ruler sat on the throne and was going to listen to both sides of the conflict in order to make a final decision. Shaden and Aslania stood below in front of the king and meekly carried out all orders. After Lady Levenshurt had finished her account of the events that had taken place, there was silence. Then the emperor turned to the second prince and asked if everything the duke's daughter had just said was true. The boy answered in the affirmative, but felt it necessary to add that he was acting in the interests of the country because his brother's behavior had become appalling and unworthy. Shaden spoke sincerely. He insisted that his brother was the reincarnation of Yongun, the great hero savior and liberator. But after meeting Aslania, Ruden went the wrong way. The cold prince described the heir to the throne as a great man destined to decide the fate of the peoples of an entire continent. And if it weren't for this girl, the crown prince would have developed along his own path and not pranced on a horse and painted his face, so Shaden decided to save his brother and the country from the impending threat. The father praised his son for his zeal, and a smile spread across the second prince's face. However, the ruler added that Ruden, in addition to many talents, strength and intelligence, was a fool from birth, and meeting the young heiress of the duke did not in any way affect his craving for eccentricities. The boy was shocked to the depths of his soul, because the emperor's wisdom was many times greater than his own, which meant that the boy had made a grave mistake and did not know what to do about it now. Moreover, the ruler revealed his plan to his son, according to which young Levenshurt was to guide the crown prince on the true path and correct his behavior. Then Shaden asked the emperor whether the royal family could trust Aslania, and where was the guarantee that this young lady would not lead the empire to troubles and misfortunes. All this time, the duke's daughter remained silent, and with her head bowed, listened to the argument between father and son. But when the conversation turned to trust in her person, she decided to intervene. The sorceress politely asked permission to speak, and having received approval, continued. She drew the emperor's attention to the fact that if the contradictions that were accumulating in the second prince's soul were not given an outlet, then over time, Shaden's heart would be filled with hatred, which was dangerous. The ruler replied that there was sense in her words, but what could be more significant for a son than his father's confidence? And Aslania said that there was a way that would dot all the I's. The duke's daughter remembered that there is an ancient and incredibly reliable way to test the sincerity of any person. Cassandra's mirror, or the mirror of truth. The artifact was created by the very first mistress of the Isaac Empire, named Cassandra, thanks to her magical abilities of the element of truth. Truth magic is quite rare in this world, so the magical object turned out to be unique and incredibly powerful, and no one could deceive the mirror. It literally saw right through everyone. The emperor was very surprised to hear from a strange girl about a secret artifact, and asked where she could have heard about it when only select nobles knew about it. Aslania came up with an answer on the fly, and said that there were legends about the magic mirror among the people, and that she once asked her father about it, although in fact it was in the description of the game secrets. The ruler became wary when he learned that a stranger was aware of the secrets of the royal treasury, because the mirror was an incredibly powerful instrument in experienced hands. Shaden stood on one knee, and with his head down, the boy thought about how it happened that the Duke's daughter knew about such things. After some thought, the king came to the conclusion that since the artifact was not a secret for Aslania, it could be used, although the second prince was clearly against it. But the father disagreed with his son, noting that what good was a magical artifact if it gathered dust in a hiding place for years, unused, and of no use to their family. And when the novice frost mage agreed with the king's arguments, the emperor then ordered the servants to immediately deliver the sacred relic to the hall. Soon the order was carried out, and a huge oval-shaped mirror appeared in front of Aslania. It was taller than she was, and in appearance was no different from ordinary mirrors. The heiress of the Livenshirt family approached the ancient artifact, and the king explained that if a person is telling the truth, the surface will glow blue, and if he is lying, it will glow red. The sorceress approached her reflection and looked at her tired and serious face. Where was the joy with which she had planned to live this new life? Having collected her thoughts, Aslania began to speak. She did not know the details of how this lie detector worked, and therefore simply followed the instructions. The first phrase of the Duke's daughter, about how she did not intend to harm or cause any harm to the first prince, was reflected by a bright bluish glow. Then the girl continued. Then, turning around and looking at Shaden, the sorceress noted that she considered Rudin a child who could be raised and made great, but if neglected, the result would be disastrous. The radiance of truth gave the girl a special aura in which her serious face seemed somehow sublime. The second prince looked at the result of the family artifact's work and began to feel remorse because he thought that Aslania was bad. But it turns out that he was cruelly mistaken. And the last thing the now relaxed sorceress said to them was an oath that she wished only goodness and prosperity for the imperial family, as well as for her empire Isaac. The emperor watched this process calmly and silently. He was pleased that his trust in the girl was not in vain. Aslania looked at the Prince of Cold, who just recently sincerely wanted to kill her, and asked if he believed her now. The boy was still standing on one knee and did not know what to do because he felt morally depressed and broken. The sorceress took the king's second son by the hand and invited him to move together towards a better future for their country. Shaden was amazed at how this fragile girl could combine so much strength, intelligence, and nobility. The next day at school went on as usual. Lessons breaks and children interacting with each other. The students turned around when they heard the boy's loud voice coming from the door. During the break, Shaden approached Aslania and publicly apologized to her for his actions. The Frost Mage said that he had taken the situation emotionally and therefore had failed to see the bigger picture and had made a fatal mistake, and now he was very remorseful and wanted to atone for his guilt. The schoolgirl drew the boy's attention to the fact that they were not just being watched, but that a whole crowd of onlookers had gathered around them. The king's second son was silent for a moment, apparently collecting his thoughts, and then continued. Shaden said that his father entrusted Aslania with the choice of punishment, so she has the right to deal with the culprit of the incident as she wishes. Beat him, expel him from school, or even deport him from the country. The Duke's daughter was horrified at the thought of what this generally good and decent boy, who sincerely cares about the empire and loves his brother, had to endure. And while the young magician was torn apart by internal pain, the schoolgirl was wondering what nickname her classmates would come up with for her after this incident. The sorceress took a deep breath and prepared to choose the fate of the second son of the king of the empire, Isaac. It was clear that the boy was extremely depressed. He even closed his eyes in fear of the unknown. Aslania placed her hand on the schoolboy's shoulder. Much like he had done before, he tried to freeze her to death, and then said that we are all human and we make mistakes. Then, young Livenshirt added that there were very few sincere patriots like Shaden, so there was no need to drop out of school or leave. She forgave him, but there was still something he had to do. On the one hand, the boy was glad that he wouldn't have to leave his homeland, but on the other hand, he was wary because he would still have to answer somehow. Aslania said that the best way to atone for her guilt would be to help raise Rudin in the right direction because she can only influence him at school, but not at home. The heir to the throne did not hear what the children were talking about, but he saw the girl put her hand on his brother's shoulder, which caused a storm of emotions in him because this was a new level of closeness. Shaden stood there and didn't know what to do because the punishment that the girl had come up with for him was in fact the meaning of his entire life, even before this incident. Then the duke's daughter extended her hand to the second prince and offered friendship since they were in the same boat and must act together. The boy stood looking at the palm extended to him and thinking about how little he still understood about people, which meant there was a lot of work ahead. At last, the second prince realized that the pause had been too long and hastened to shake hands, saying that it would be a great gift for him to have such a friend as Lady Levenshurt. After a few weeks, Rudin suddenly realized that his once carefree life had turned into a real nightmare and horror. At school, the duke's daughter followed him closely, and at home, his own brother did not lag behind, so the boy was completely deprived of a place where he could relax. Shaden and Aslania literally did not give the first prince a break and tried to control all his actions and stop his pranks. The duke's daughter also transferred to the class where Rudin studied and created a rule for the heir to the empire that prohibited him from committing more than 3 pranks a day. Otherwise, Levenshurt would stop communicating with him. At some point, the crown prince began to notice sidelong glances from his classmates. He was rapidly losing the respect of those around him despite his privileged status. The boy had hoped to get some relief from the discomfort, at least in a home environment, but now that was also impossible. Shaden kept his word to the duke's daughter and tirelessly controlled his brother as soon as he crossed the threshold of the palace. Sometimes the second prince did this secretly, silently following the emperor's son through the corridors, and even the boy's sleep was now observed from the outside. In fact, Rudin found himself under total control. The crown prince's friends, whom he invited to visit, noticed that he did not even notice their presence, and sometimes simply talked to himself. The king's son looked unhappy and did not know what to do. He tried to share the situation with those around him, but no one wanted to take his side. On the contrary, friends advised their classmate to comply with the girl's request and behave more restrainedly since it was so easy for them to control their words and actions. But for Rudin, the need to look after himself was unbearable because he was used to behaving as he wanted. Moreover, the crown prince was confident that all his words came from the heart, but his friends hinted that his speeches were too full of self-praise, pride, and stupidity. The first prince's friend looked at his classmate and didn't know what other words to choose to explain basic things to him. He couldn't just call him a fool, could he? Then, a friend advised Rudin to stop talking altogether and to open his mouth only in extreme cases, because then words that Aslania might not like would not be spoken. The heir to the empire found this idea very interesting, because if he were to pronounce only the most important words, the chance of error would be reduced to a minimum. The next day at school, when the first prince and the duke's daughter met, the boy decided to try his new tactic. Rudin smiled at the thought that today he would begin to surprise young Levenshurt. The children greeted each other, and Aslania asked if the king's son would be fooling around today, to which he slyly replied that he had completely different plans. The sorceress noted that she was pleased with the changes in the crown prince's mood, and hoped that they would lead him to a better life and true success. The boy stood and analyzed the situation. Yesterday he was eloquent and was ignored by the girl, but today he is simply silent, and she agrees to communicate with him. Rudin thought that achieving his goals was not so difficult. He just needed to monitor his body and suppress its attempts to do something unnecessary before it happened. Thus, day after day, habit after habit, Shaden and Aslania formed a new emperor who would eventually lead the country. After the crown prince stopped saying out loud everything that came into his head, he began to seem like an adequate and quite restrained person, and his actions stopped sounding childish. Young Levenshurt sat at her desk and reflected on how Rudin's reputation had finally begun to grow, everyone praising his reserved smile and balanced decisions. However, if everything was more or less clear with the king's son, then Juven began to instill concern because the boy developed some kind of incomprehensible hobby for the sake of which he disappeared every now and then. What depressed Aslania most was the fact that her little brother began to lie, saying that he had found a part-time job in the city because she knew how much money the boy received for pocket money. There was indeed cause for concern for Appleton's son, as nocturnal adventures under the full moon were becoming a regular occurrence for him, and while other children slept at home in their beds or read an engaging book before bed, the Marquise's son, wrapped in a dark cloak, walked outside the city walls. On this path, Juven was not alone. He had comrades who shared his values and life priorities. True, it cannot be said that the young man was on equal terms with these desperate and experienced people. Not at all. For example, the accomplices came to the meeting with their faces uncovered, but the young gentleman wore a mask. But the main difference was that they completely obeyed Juven and addressed him extremely politely as their master and lord. The teenager's subordinates called him Jurian and admired his strength and achievements. He tried to force them to speak to him as an equal, but the people were adamant and continued to grovel. Not wanting to waste time on empty arguments, the boy preferred to give in and allow his comrades to flatter him a little. In response, the club members called the young gentleman an outstanding adventurer who had proven his abilities in action. Juven replied that there was nothing supernatural about his talents, to which his new friends reacted with genuine surprise. The adventurer organization had 6 levels of mastery, and reaching the highest level took about 10 years. But Urian reached the peak of his career in just 3 months, which was admired by his comrades. The partners also apologized for not being able to find the high-difficulty dungeon that their new friend needed to progress. In fact, the guy had passed this test some time ago, but he didn't want to report it to the Adventurers Club, wanting to keep this news in reserve. Reaching the maximum level in this closed society is very difficult. At the moment, there are only 5 such people in the entire world. Juven arrived at the appointed place to meet the most outstanding adventurer of his time. The teenager looked around but did not see anyone. Perhaps he had arrived earlier than scheduled, or his colleague was late. Suddenly, right behind him, the Marquise's son heard someone's cheerful voice, asking the boy who he was looking for in such a place, at such a late hour. After using the spell, Urian flew forward a few meters and turned around, but his interlocutor assured him that there was no need to be afraid, because he did not intend to harm him. The Marquise's son asked when the stranger had managed to sneak up, to which he replied that he had arrived here a long time ago and had managed to blend into the surroundings, so the boy simply hadn't noticed him. Then the great adventurer quickly came over and put his hand on the boy's shoulder, saying that they needed to sit down and talk. His hand was so strong that Urian only cried out in pain and dropped to one knee, so powerful was the touch. It was a very strange magic, which the heir of Appleton had never encountered before, and he was powerless to resist it. Meanwhile, the man sat down opposite him, crossed his legs and smiled, and Juven could finally get a good look at him. He was a very young guy, with a simple face and a friendly appearance. He thanked the teenager for the tasks he had completed and praised him for his diligence in the field of adventurers. However, the boy said that he had carried out the quests not of his own free will, but on the orders of the guild, to which the stranger replied that the leadership of the Old Tree Society received orders from him. Then Juven was told that he had not come this entire way for nothing. It was a series of difficult tests to test his readiness to join the organization and gain a decent status within it. The great adventurer added that if Urian had refused even once or failed the mission, this meeting would never have taken place. But as it was, everyone got what they wanted. After a short pause, the guy licked his lips very slyly and said that this was all part of a bigger plan. The boy felt a little uneasy because he realized that for the last 3 months, he had been playing someone else's complex and incomprehensible game. In response, the guildmate handed the teenager a crumpled piece of paper and added that the checks had come to an end, which meant it was time to explain and tell everything. And while the boy was peering at the contents of the note, his comrade explained that he had been closely watching him all this time and was very pleased with the information he had collected. The message was the official application to join the Adventurers Society that Jurian had written 3 months ago, only at the bottom now, was his real name, Juven Appleton. The Marquise's son was shocked that the secret of his true identity had been revealed, and apparently the guild had known about it for a long time. And when the stranger loudly called the boy by name, indicating his status, the guildmates standing to the side began to actively whisper among themselves because everyone in the city knew this dark magician. Juven asked how they knew his name, to which the stranger laughed, raised his finger, and stated that it was very easy. It's very difficult to hide such powerful magic, and since there aren't many powerful young mages, it was easy to piece together the facts. The guy added that he had identified Appleton's heir almost immediately after he had seen what kind of magic the candidate for joining the guild was using. Sitting under the trees and admiring the upcoming sunset, the adventurer added that a mask on the face cannot hide age and provides more of an illusion of mystery than real protection. The examiner then drew attention to the lines in the questionnaire that stated the candidate's ultimate goal: praise for a loved one. The teenager actually set himself such a task, but he never thought that it would be examined under a magnifying glass. The guild member added that he found this point very interesting and deserving of special attention. Then the adventurer raised his finger to the boy's face and said that they were about to have a man-to-man talk, and therefore Juven should take off his mask. Reluctantly, the boy removed the white object, and everyone present enthusiastically greeted the heir of Appleton. Then he asked what important thing they managed to find out about his personal life. The interlocutor replied that judging by his information, Lady Livenshirt was precisely the object of the young adventurer's adoration, since they studied at the same school and spent a lot of time together. Once again, the Marquis's son was shocked by the news that the guild not only gives tasks, but also spies on candidates. The guy replied that it was quite easy to recognize a boy in love by the way he looked at a girl talk to her, and how he reacted to the mention of her person, like now. But the next phrase from his older friend struck Juven right in the heart, because he said that under the current circumstances, they would not be able to be together. The guild member continued and said that the Appleton heir's desire to become stronger than Aslania was understandable, but given her potential achieving this goal would take years. And would she wait that long? The dark magician replied that there was no other worthy candidate around the sorceress except him, so she would definitely wait. To which the guildmate objected that Livenshirt was not only strong, she was also smart, so she herself saw the lack of candidates, which meant that over time she would begin to lower the bar for them. It was inevitable. Juven didn't know what to answer, since the great adventurer's words seemed to be true. He also added that while young Appleton was developing his powers, others were establishing relationships with the lady. In conclusion, the senior comrade noted that the magician could indeed become the most powerful and surpass Aslania. But will there still be room for him in her heart by that time? After these words, the guildmate fell silent, and a sly smile froze on his face, which he seemed to never part with. After pausing and examining the trees, the great adventurer continued and said that he knew the right way out of this situation and would help the young magician realize his plans. Belton was indeed an expert in such matters, but he never helped without reason. This man experienced the deepest moral satisfaction from contemplating love affairs, and especially the tragedies of unhappy love. Moreover, he liked to create and weave them. Possessing an incredible penchant for behind-the-scenes games, the great adventurer could play people like chess pieces, playing out all sorts of games, according to his own scenario. And now, Juven, having succumbed to the truth of Belton's words, already asked his comrade for help and advice, to which he happily responded, assuring that he would make every effort to resolve the issue. The Marquis's son felt uneasy because he had chased his dream and had really begun to communicate much less with Aslania, for whose sake he had started all this development. Belton was the most inquisitive and nosy member of the Adventurers Guild, and as soon as he read Juven's statement, he immediately became interested in the love story of the noble families.